The tiny gold chain broke before the betrothal register was opened, and Lady Lydia Staveley heard it fall. No one else noticed at first. Not Mr. Rupert Mowbray, who stood beside the winter garden table, with his pale fingers resting too carefully on the stem of his wineglass. Not Miss Elspeth Loxley, who had just released Lydia's wrist with a soft little murmur about the clasp sitting crooked. Not the gathered aunts, cousins, neighbours, and useful witnesses who had come to Staveley House that May morning to see an engagement made respectable in ink. They were all looking at the register. They were all waiting for Lydia to become fixed upon a page. Only Lydia felt the sudden lightness at her wrist, where her mother's coral cameo bracelet had loosened against her glove. She lowered her eyes for the space of one breath. The cameo still rested there, oval and warm against the white kid, its carved profile turned toward the glass roof as though Lady Staveley herself were looking up through the panes at the pale London sky. The safety chain had vanished. Lydia did not bend to search for it. A lady did not crawl under a breakfast table before guests. Even for the last small guard of the last jewel her mother had left behind. So she closed her fingers around the bracelet and lifted her chin. The winter garden glittered with polite expectation. Orange blossoms had been set in silver bowls along the long white cloth. A silver urn breathed steam near a tower of sugared cakes. Ferns pressed dark green shadows against the glass walls. Beyond them, Mayfair waited with its carriages, its calling cards, its unforgiving memory. Inside, every chair had been placed with intention. Every guest had been chosen, because a betrothal witnessed by enough proper people became not merely affection, but fact. Lydia stood in the center of that careful fact in a gown of pale dove silk chosen by her aunt for modest hopefulness. She was 26, old enough for whispers, young enough for pity, and trained by years of family economies to smile as though neither mattered. Rupert had been late to breakfast. That should have warned her. He had arrived after the vicar's widow, after Lady Marwen, after even his own aunt, with Elspeth beside him in a sprigged muslin morning dress that made her look harmless as cream. Elspeth had kissed Lydia's cheek, cool and fragrant with violets, and said, "Dearest, your bracelet has turned. Let me fix it. You must look perfect today." Lydia had let her. Of course, she had let her. Elspeth had been her closest friend since their first season. The woman to whom Lydia had entrusted every foolish hope she would not have dared confess to a sister. Elspeth knew that Lydia wore the coral cameo whenever courage was required. Elspeth knew that Lady Staveley had fastened it around Lydia's wrist the last autumn before her death, and whispered that a woman must sometimes carry tenderness where the world expected ornament. The memory had steadied Lydia through mourning, through reduced pin money, through 3 seasons in which Rupert Mowbray had approached slowly enough to seem sincere. Now Elspeth's hand had just been there. Elspeth's thumb had pressed the clasp. Elspeth's smile had lingered too long. At the far end of the winter garden, the footman opened the door. A hush passed lightly through the guests, not silence yet, but the beginning of importance. Gervase Fenton, Duke of North-wick, had arrived. He was not expected. That was clear from the way Lady Marwen's brows lifted and Rupert's hand tightened around his glass. A duke did not drift accidentally into a family betrothal breakfast. He was invited, received, announced, arranged for. Yet there he stood, just inside the doorway, tall and darkly composed, his morning coat cut with severe elegance, his expression so controlled that it made the room seem suddenly untidy. He had the kind of presence that did not ask for space. It received it. Conversations thinned. A cousin stepped back without knowing she had moved. Even the silver urn appeared to quiet its breath. Lydia had met him only twice before, both times across crowded rooms, both times briefly enough that she had remembered his eyes more than his words. They were grey, steady, and difficult to deceive. Now they moved over the winter garden, not with idle curiosity, but with assessment. They passed Rupert. They paused on Elspeth. Then they came to Lydia's hand, where it enclosed the loosened cameo. His gaze did not linger rudely. It merely saw. That was worse, somehow, or better. Lydia could not decide. Lord Staveley, her father, recovered first and gave a flustered welcome, explaining something about mutual acquaintances and a late acceptance, though Lydia knew very well. Her father had no idea why the Duke had come. Chairs were adjusted. Polite bows were exchanged. The register, bound in dark blue leather and placed near the orange blossoms, lay unopened beside the inkwell. It had belonged to the Staveley family for 3 generations. Births, marriages, deaths, settlements, witnesses, promises. All recorded in a hand that pretended human hearts could be made orderly. Lydia had imagined signing it with a calm she did not feel, not because Rupert had inspired wild devotion, but because he had seemed kind, and kindness in a woman's life could be mistaken for safety. Rupert turned toward the guests. The movement was too theatrical. Lydia felt it before she understood it. Elspeth lowered her lashes. Rupert cleared his throat once, and the sound slipped beneath the glass roof like a knife drawn from silk. "Before anything is entered," he said, "I must speak with honesty." Lady Marwen went still. Lydia's fingers tightened over the cameo until its carved edge pressed into her glove. Rupert did not look at her. That was when she knew. Not feared. Knew. "I have tried to proceed as duty required," he continued, his voice modest, wounded, practiced. "Lady Lydia has every virtue a gentleman might respect, but respect cannot be made into marriage. My heart, despite every effort at restraint, belongs elsewhere." A cup touched a saucer too sharply. Someone drew in a breath. Lydia heard the fern leaves tremble where a servant had moved behind them. Elspeth whispered, "Rupert," as though pained by his courage. The whisper was perfect. "I love Miss Loxley," Rupert said, and finally he looked at Lydia with the expression of a man presenting himself as victim to the woman he had struck. "I cannot sign my name beside yours while knowing I would be false to us both." The winter garden became bright in a terrible way. Every pane of glass, every spoon, every polished handle seemed to reflect Lydia back to herself. Discarded, observed, expected to collapse beautifully or forgive nobly. Her father made a small sound of outrage, but it lacked strength. Rupert's aunt pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Elspeth stepped toward Lydia, her eyes shining. "Lydia, dearest, I never meant for this to happen. You must believe me. We fought against it." Lydia looked at the woman who had adjusted her bracelet minutes before the announcement. Elspeth's pale hand hovered, ready to take hers, ready to perform tenderness before all London's future gossip. Lydia did not offer her hand. "How exhausting it must have been," Lydia said quietly. Elspeth's face flickered. Rupert flushed. A murmur travelled down the table. Lydia had not meant to speak sharply. She had meant, perhaps, not to speak at all. Silence had always been safer. Silence prevented fathers from worrying, aunts from advising, servants from pitying, friends from leaning close to gather wounds they could later display as secrets. But silence, she realized, had brought her here too. It had let Rupert rehearse nobility. It had let Elspeth dress betrayal in muslin and violets. The register waited open to receive a truth that had already been murdered. Rupert drew himself up. "I know you are hurt." "No," Lydia said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You know I am witnessed." The words settled harder than anger would have done. Across the room, the Duke of North-wick looked at her again, and something in his stillness changed. Not softened, sharpened. Rupert's mouth tightened. "This is painful for everyone. How generous of you to distribute it equally." A shocked little laugh escaped one of the younger cousins before her mother silenced her. Lydia felt heat climb her throat, but she did not look away. She did not look at the register. She did not look beneath the table for the missing chain. She kept one hand over her mother's cameo and the other at her side. Elspeth's eyes filled more deliberately. "Please don't make this cruel. I couldn't bear it if you hated me." Lydia almost smiled then, not from amusement, but from the strange distance that comes when pain becomes too clear to confuse. "You chose a very public room for a private tenderness, Elspeth." Rupert stepped forward. "Enough. Miss Loxley has suffered as well." That was when a small sound cut through the winter garden. A chair leg, perhaps, or a heel against marble. The Duke of North-wick had moved. He did not come to Lydia yet. He bent near the edge of the long table, just where Elspeth had been standing when she touched the bracelet. When he straightened, something minute rested against his gloved fingers. Gold, a broken safety chain, no longer than a breath. Lydia saw it, and the room narrowed around that glint. Her mother's bracelet had not merely loosened. It had been made vulnerable. The Duke closed his hand around the chain with controlled care, as though even that small broken thing deserved custody. His eyes lifted first to Elspeth, then to Rupert, then to Lydia, in that order. He had seen the arrangement of the room. He had seen who stood where. He had seen the little detail everyone else had missed. Lydia's breath caught, but she gave him nothing more. She had already been made into spectacle once that morning. She would not beg a stranger, even a duke, to interpret her wound. Rupert took Elspeth's hand. The gesture was meant to finish the scene. It was meant to make tenderness the victor, to leave Lydia with dignity, only if she stepped aside and blessed the knife. Around them, witnesses shifted toward the inevitable. Someone would close the register. Someone would guide Lydia to a chair. Someone would say she had behaved well, considering. The Duke's gaze remained on the broken chain in his palm. Then he looked at Lydia's face. Not with pity, not with triumph, but with an attention so steady that the noise of the room seemed to fall away from her. For the first time that morning, Lydia felt not rescued, not comforted, not avenged, seen. The Duke took one measured step toward the table as Rupert extended his hand fully to Elspeth, and the tiny gold chain lay hidden inside his closed fist like a secret waiting to speak. The Duke of North-wick did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The winter garden had already begun arranging itself around his silence, as if every person beneath the glass roof understood that rank, when held without hurry, could be more commanding than anger. Rupert Mowbray still stood with Elspeth's hand in his, trying to appear wounded rather than relieved. Elspeth's lashes trembled with practiced distress. Lord Staveley hovered near the register. Flushed with embarrassment and fury he did not yet know where to place. Lydia remained beside the long breakfast table, with her mother's cameo held against her wrist, the missing safety chain now hidden in the Duke's gloved hand. That small absence seemed louder to her than all the whispers. The bracelet was still there, but it felt exposed, as though the world had seen where it could be broken. The Duke looked at Rupert first. "Mr. Mowbray." Rupert's mouth tightened. "Your Grace, you have chosen an unusual stage for honesty." A faint ripple passed through the guests. Rupert's aunt stiffened, already offended on behalf of the man who had just humiliated another household. Rupert drew himself up. "I regret the necessity, but a gentleman must not enter marriage where affection has become impossible." "Affection became impossible this morning?" the Duke asked. Rupert hesitated. Elspeth's fingers tightened around his. "No," Rupert said, "not this morning. I have struggled for some time." Lydia felt the words strike less sharply than she expected. Perhaps because the deepest cut had already landed. Perhaps because the Duke's question had placed Rupert's nobility under glass, where everyone could examine it. Then Lady Lydia was invited today to stand before a register you never intended to sign. The Duke's tone remained almost mild. That made the sentence devastating. Lord Staveley took a step forward. "Mowbray, is this true?" Rupert coloured. "I intended to do what was honourable until I understood that deception would be worse." Lydia looked at him then. "You discovered your conscience between the salmon and the signatures." A strangled cough came from the far side of the table. Lady Marwen's fan stopped moving. Elspeth's face lost a little of its softness. Rupert turned toward Lydia with wounded reproach. "I know you are hurt." "Don't use hurt as a curtain," Lydia said. "It doesn't hide the stage." For the first time she saw anger in him. Not guilt. Anger that she would not be gracious enough to make his betrayal easier. Elspeth stepped in gently, beautifully. "Lydia, please." Rupert never wished to shame you. He believed you understood. His regard had altered. In spirit, if not in words, you had released him. The room shifted. There it was, the first attempt to make Lydia an accomplice in her own abandonment. If she had released him, then she had no right to bleed. If she had understood, then today was merely awkward, not cruel. Lydia's palm closed harder over the cameo. "In spirit," she repeated. "How convenient. Spirits leave no ink." Rupert seized the opening. "There are forms of understanding that don't require written statements." "Then why was I invited to sign my own abandonment?" The question crossed the winter garden and emptied it. Even the guests, who had been eager to watch now, seemed to understand that something improper had taken shape beyond a failed romance. Rupert's gaze slid to the register, then away. Elspeth lowered her head. For one dangerous instant, Lydia thought she might shake. Not visibly, perhaps. She had been trained too well for that. But inside, where her mother's voice had once lived, something old and tender wavered. The cameo edge pressed into her glove. Her wrist felt bare without the chain. Then the Duke moved. He came forward with measured courtesy, neither rushing to rescue nor standing back to enjoy the ruin. He stopped at the corner of the table, close enough that Lydia could see the broken chain resting across his palm, a thin gold curve against black leather. He did not hand it to her at once. Instead, he placed it on a folded white calling card beside the coral bracelet, careful not to touch her wrist. The chain was so small that several guests leaned forward to see it. Elspeth went still. Lydia noticed because the Duke had noticed first. "This fell," he said, before Mr. Mowbray's declaration was complete. Lydia looked down at the chain. It lay like a question no one had expected an object to ask. "Thank you, Your Grace." Her voice was steadier than she felt. Their fingers nearly met over the card when she reached to draw it nearer. The Duke withdrew first, a fractional movement, but unmistakable. He gave her space as deliberately as another man might have taken her hand. That restraint struck her with surprising force. She had spent the morning being handled by other people's intentions. Elspeth's adjustment of the bracelet. Rupert's public sorrow. Society's hungry pity. The Duke alone had placed something before her and left the choice of touching it to her. "Lady Lydia," he said. The use of her name held no familiarity, only respect. Every face in the room turned toward them. Lydia lifted her eyes. His were grey and unreadable, but not cold. "I cannot undo what has been performed here," he continued, "nor would I insult you by pretending that a lady's dignity requires a gentleman to lend it to her." A murmur stirred, quickly stifled. Rupert's expression hardened. Elspeth's mouth parted. Lydia felt her heartbeat once, sharply. "But I can refuse," the Duke said, "to let this register close upon a lie, while every witness present pretends not to see the ink drying before the pen has touched the page." He turned slightly, enough to include the room without giving it command over the moment. "Lady Lydia, will you do me the honor of considering my hand before they close that register upon a lie?" The winter garden fell into the kind of silence Lydia had only read about in novels and never believed. Silver spoons ceased moving. Silk skirts stilled. Someone near the orange blossoms whispered, "His Grace," and was immediately hushed. Rupert looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Elspeth's hand slipped from his. Lydia could not breathe for 1 second. Not because she loved the Duke. She did not know him. Not because she believed herself saved. She had no wish to be passed from one man's convenience to another man's grandeur. It was the wording that held her, considering, not accepting, his hand, not his command, before they closed the register, not after society had finished burying her. "Your Grace," Rupert said, recovering with visible effort, "this is absurd. You cannot mean to make a proposal out of sympathy." The Duke did not look at him. "I do not make proposals out of sympathy." Then, out of outrage. Outrage is more honest than cowardice, but it is still not sufficient for marriage. The quiet precision of the reply sent another current through the guests. Lydia should have felt exposed by his offer. Instead, she felt the strangest widening of the air around her, as if the room that had been shrinking since Rupert rose to speak had finally given her a place to stand. The Duke's gaze remained on her. "You may refuse me now," he said, and his voice lowered enough that it belonged to her more than to the room, though everyone could still hear. "You may refuse me later. If you do, I will still escort your reputation out of this house with more care than others have shown it within." Lady Marwen's eyes softened, though her posture remained vigilant. Lord Staveley looked bewildered by the sudden arrival of power on his daughter's side. Lydia looked at the broken chain on the card. Her mother's bracelet had been weakened before the betrayal. That was fact. The Duke had seen it. That was also fact. Yet facts did not make trust. "You are generous," she said. "No," the answer came at once. "I am attentive. They are not the same thing." Something in Lydia's chest trembled, then steadied. Elspeth found her voice. "Lydia, you can't seriously entertain this. You don't know His Grace." Lydia turned her head. "I knew you. It was not loud. It did not need to be." Elspeth flinched as though simplicity had struck harder than accusation. Rupert stepped forward, anger now poorly leashed. "This display will ruin her more thoroughly. Society will say she seized the first title offered after being disappointed." "Society," the Duke said, "is often most confident when most ignorant." Then at last he looked at Rupert. "But let us not flatter the present company by calling it society yet." Lady Marwen covered the smallest possible smile with her fan. Lydia almost felt one of her own, but grief held it back. This was still her betrothal breakfast. Her father's register still lay unopened. The man she had meant to marry stood beside the woman she had called friend. Her mother's bracelet was broken. No duke's sentence could make that painless. She took the folded card with the safety chain upon it and closed it carefully in her gloved hand. "Your Grace," she said, "I will not answer a public humiliation with a public falsehood, even a flattering one." His expression did not change, but his attention deepened. "I would expect nothing less." "Then I will speak with you privately, with my aunt present." "Of course, and until I have done so, no one in this room will claim I accepted, refused, encouraged, pursued, or understood anything that I have not said plainly." The Duke inclined his head. Plainly heard and witnessed. Lydia looked at the guests. Some had the grace to lower their eyes. Others stared with the fascinated discomfort of people watching a woman refuse the role assigned to her. She turned back to Rupert and Elspeth. "You may keep your affection," she said, "but you will not keep my silence as proof that you were kind." Then Lady Marwen came to her side, firm as a drawn curtain. The Duke stepped back, giving Lydia the path to leave first. He did not offer his arm. Not yet. He understood, somehow, that even rescue could become another hand closing around her wrist if offered too soon. Lydia walked from the winter garden with the broken chain in her hand, the coral cameo still loose against her pulse, and behind her the register remained open, unsigned, and unable to tell its lie. The morning room at Staveley House had never seemed so small. It was not truly small, of course. Nothing in Lord Staveley's house had been built for intimacy. The ceiling was high, the mantel white marble, the carpet patterned with faded roses that had survived 3 generations of careful feet. Yet, after the glass brightness of the winter garden, after the table of witnesses and the register that still lay open behind them, this room felt like the inside of a held breath. Lady Marwen closed the door herself, rather than allowing the footman to linger. That single, brisk action did more to restore Lydia than any embrace could have done. It placed a boundary between her and the faces beyond the hall. It declared that the spectacle was finished, at least for the moment. Lydia stood beside the writing table and opened her gloved hand. The folded white calling card rested in her palm. Upon it lay the tiny gold safety chain from her mother's coral cameo bracelet. The chain looked absurdly delicate against the card, too slight to have borne so much meaning, too small to have made an entire room shift when the Duke of North-wick placed it before her. Her bracelet still circled her wrist, but without the chain it felt unsafe, as though a memory could fall if she moved too quickly. Lady Marwen glanced at it, then at Lydia's face. "Sit down, child." Lydia almost obeyed. Then she did not. If she sat, she feared she might discover how tired her knees were. Not yet. The Duke, who had entered last and remained near the door until Lady Marwen indicated the chair opposite Lydia, bowed with controlled courtesy. "As you prefer, Lady Lydia." It was a small sentence. It should not have mattered. Yet after Rupert's public assumption that he could narrate her understanding, and Elspeth's tender claim that Lydia must have known in spirit, the phrase carried unexpected weight. "As you prefer," not as the room preferred, not as the scandal required, not as a duke commanded. Lydia placed the folded card on the writing table. "Before anything else is said, Your Grace, I must know whether you meant that offer as a proposal, a shield, or a punishment for Mr. Mowbray." Lady Marwen's brows rose, but she did not correct her. The Duke's expression altered only by a fraction. Lydia had the impression he approved of the question. Or perhaps he merely respected its necessity. "Not a punishment," he said. "I do not use marriage as a cudgel. Men have used it for less. Yes, he accepted that without defense. They have." The room quieted around the admission. It was not flattery. It was not apology. It was a fact placed between them without decoration. Lydia lifted her chin. Then it was a shield. Partly. Partly is a dangerous word. So is rescue when offered before a lady has chosen whether she wishes to be carried. Lady Marwen's fan paused halfway open. Lydia looked at him more carefully. Gervase Fenton, Duke of North-wick, did not look like a man accustomed to explaining himself. His stillness seemed bred into him, polished by rank and sharpened by years of being obeyed before he needed to repeat a command. But he stood now in her aunt's morning room with his hands at his sides, as if deliberately preventing them from becoming arguments. "I asked publicly," he said, "because the injury was public. Had I waited until the room had decided what you must be, my private regard would have done little against the story already forming." "Your private regard?" The words escaped before Lydia could soften them. "We have spoken perhaps 12 sentences to each other in our lives. 16, I think." She stared at him, for the first time since Rupert had stood to betray her. A feeling dangerously close to laughter touched the edge of her grief. "You counted? Not intentionally. That makes it worse." "I see that." His mouth did not smile, but something in his eyes warmed. Only a little. Enough to unsettle her more than grandeur would have done. Lady Marwen looked from one to the other and gave the faintest clearing of her throat. Lydia remembered herself. She turned back to the table and touched the edge of the calling card. Careful not to move the chain. "I will not trade one public lie for a more flattering one, nor should you. If society says I was discarded, then I will survive that. If society says I seized the nearest coronet to hide the wound, I may survive that too, but I will not assist either falsehood. Then we must make a third account available. Truth, if we can find it." That answer chilled the small warmth between them. Lydia looked toward the door, beyond which the winter garden still held the people who had watched her humiliation, as if it were an unexpected entertainment at breakfast. "You think there is more truth than Rupert being weak and Elspeth being cruel." The Duke's gaze went to the bracelet. He did not stare long enough to be improper. "I think Miss Loxley touched your bracelet immediately before its safety chain fell. I think Mr. Mowbray spoke as though rehearsed. I think the register was waiting before anyone had asked whether you still wished to sign it. And I think a man who truly discovers his heart at breakfast does not arrive with the woman he loves already beside him." Lydia felt the words gather inside her. They did not comfort her. They clarified the room. Lady Marwen crossed to the writing table and bent over the chain. "This must be preserved." "Yes," the Duke said. He withdrew a small, unused envelope from the writing desk only after Lady Marwen gave him permission with a nod. "May I?" he asked Lydia. Again that question. Again the space around it. Lydia looked at the chain lying on his calling card. "You found it. You own it." Her throat tightened so unexpectedly that she looked down. Rupert had spoken of affection. Elspeth had spoken of forgiveness. Neither had thought to speak of ownership. "Then seal it here," she said, "with my aunt's wax. I want no one to say it passed privately into your keeping without witness." "Sensible," Lady Marwen said. This time the Duke did smile. It was brief, almost hidden, but Lydia saw it. Very sensible. Lady Marwen rang for wax and dismissed the servant as soon as it arrived. Together, under her supervision, Lydia slid the tiny chain into the envelope. The Duke wrote the date, place, and circumstances in a precise hand. Found beneath the breakfast table at Staveley House, after Miss Loxley adjusted Lady Lydia Staveley's coral cameo bracelet, and before Mr. Mowbray's declaration was complete. He did not embellish, he did not accuse. That made the sentence stronger. Lady Marwen sealed it with her own plain red wax. Lydia watched the wax cool. Evidence. The word felt severe for something that had rested against her mother's jewel only an hour ago. The Duke set the sealed envelope on the table, not in his pocket. Lady Lydia, I propose a provisional courtship of 30 days. Lady Marwen's fan opened fully. Lydia turned slowly. That is not a phrase one hears often. It may not be romantic. It is certainly not poetic. Poetry has caused a great deal of trouble this morning. There it was again, that almost humor, dry as paper and carefully controlled. Lydia wanted to resent it. Instead, she found it steadied the room. What would this provisional courtship mean? She asked, publicly. That my offer was not a theatrical impulse. Privately, that you owe me no answer until we understand whether this morning was only a betrayal or something prepared in advance. Your aunt would be present at all proper meetings. My solicitor can examine the register and any correspondence. If, after 30 days, you wish me gone from your life, I will make that withdrawal in a manner that leaves your conduct above reproach. Above reproach. The phrase was familiar, polished, aristocratic. Yet beneath it lay something more difficult. A man offering not to win, but to retreat cleanly if asked. Lydia folded her hands before her, hiding the unsteadiness in her fingers. And if I am publicly slandered during those 30 days, then I answer publicly. No, the word came too quickly. He stilled. Lady Marwen looked at her sharply. Lydia forced herself to continue. You may stand with me publicly. You may not answer for me publicly unless I cannot speak. I have had enough words placed in my mouth today. The Duke's eyes held hers. Agreed. No hesitation. No wounded pride. Just that. Agreed. Lydia had expected argument. Perhaps persuasion. Perhaps the velvet pressure of rank. Its absence left her strangely exposed. You agree very easily for a duke. Only when the lady is right. Lady Marwen made a small sound that could have been approval or warning. Lydia did not look away from him. I have another condition. Name it. If you discover something ugly, you will not bury it for my comfort. The air changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The Duke's face became stiller, and Lydia understood she had touched some private nerve without knowing where it lay. Truth can wound, he said. So can silence. Silence simply leaves fewer witnesses. He looked at her for a long moment. Then I give you my word. I will not settle quietly what has been made public against you. Lydia believed he meant it. She did not yet know whether he could keep it. Those were different matters. Before she could answer, there came a brisk knock. Lady Marwen opened the door only a hand's breadth and took a note from her own maid. Her expression tightened as she read. Lord Staveley's man says your solicitor has already sent up a message, Your Grace. The Duke took the folded paper only when Lady Marwen passed it to him. He read it once. His gaze lifted to Lydia. The final page of the betrothal register was replaced last night. Lydia felt the morning room tilt around that fact. Replaced? The paper is newer than the rest of the volume. The ruling does not match. Rupert's betrayal had been cruel. Elspeth's performance had been crueler. But this was colder than either. A page had been prepared before Lydia ever entered the winter garden. A place had been made for a lie before she had been invited to stand in it. Lady Marwen's voice came low. Then this was not merely a man losing courage. No, the Duke said. It was arranged. Lydia looked down at her bracelet, at the cameo still turned outward, at the red wax sealing the broken chain on the table. Her mother had told her to carry tenderness where the world expected ornament. Today, tenderness had become evidence. She drew a careful breath. "Then we shall have 30 days, Your Grace." The Duke bowed, not triumphantly, not tenderly, but as if he had been entrusted with something more binding than acceptance. 30 days, Lady Lydia. Outside the morning room, the house still murmured with scandal. Inside, the first shape of truth had appeared, narrow as a broken gold chain and impossible now to ignore. By 11 o'clock the next morning, Staveley House had become a place where pity arrived on calling cards. The first carriage stopped before the door, while the breakfast scandal was still less than a day old, which proved, Lady Marwen observed, that sympathy in London could move faster than decency. Lydia heard the wheels from the small drawing-room and did not move from the chair nearest the window. She had slept little. The house had not slept at all. Servants walked more softly than usual, as if sound might bruise her. Her father had spent the previous evening in his library sending contradictory messages to Mr. Mowbray's family, first demanding explanation, then warning against further insult, then asking Lady Marwen whether a duke's public offer altered everything or made everything worse. Lady Marwen had answered that men ought not ask questions of consequence after midnight, when they had failed to ask them before breakfast. The sealed envelope containing the broken gold safety chain now lay locked in Lady Marwen's travelling writing case, marked with the Duke's precise words, and secured by her plain red wax. Lydia's coral cameo bracelet remained upon her wrist, because taking it off felt too much like surrender, but without the chain it sat uneasily over her glove. A faint red line still marked the skin beneath where the clasp had twisted. She had examined it once in the looking-glass at dawn, then covered it again. Pain that small did not deserve ceremony. Betrayal did not become grander because it left a visible trace. The second carriage arrived before the first caller had removed her bonnet. By noon, the drawing-room smelled of damp wool, lavender water, and curiosity disguised as kindness. Lady Teversham came first, round and soft and merciless, murmuring that no one blamed Lydia in the least, which was always the beginning of blaming. Mrs. Vale came after her, saying that gentlemen were often overcome by their deeper feelings at inconvenient moments, as if Rupert Mowbray had been struck by lightning rather than seated beside his accomplice. Two Mrs. Harbin brought sugared almonds and watched Lydia's face each time Elspeth's name was mentioned. Lady Marwen sat like a narrow sword in black silk near the tea-table, and permitted no one to linger over long. Lydia accepted each expression of concern with the composure of a woman receiving weather reports. "You are very brave, my dear," Lady Teversham said, leaning close enough for Lydia to see the powder gathered near her eyelashes, though perhaps it is easier when one has such extraordinary consolation. Lydia lifted her cup. "If you mean His Grace, I have not accepted consolation from him. But surely after such a public declaration, His Grace asked me to consider." Lady Teversham blinked. "There is a difference. In well-run households," Lady Marwen said. "There often is." A pause followed. Lydia sipped her tea. It had gone cold, but the porcelain steadied her hand. Another caller tried a different blade. "Miss Loxley is quite prostrate, I hear. Such a tender creature. She wrote to you, did she not, at that exact moment, as though society had trained? Coincidence to obey drama?" A footman entered with a white envelope on a salver and a spray of lilies wrapped in damp paper. Lydia saw Elspeth's hand before the servant spoke. She had always admired that handwriting. It curved delicately, with little flourishes that made even ordinary words look innocent. Lady Marwen reached for the note first. From Miss Loxley. Every woman in the room became still. Not silent, still. Silence might have suggested respect. This was appetite. Lydia set down her cup. "Read it, Aunt." Lady Marwen broke the seal and scanned the page. Her mouth tightened. "It says, 'I hope you will forgive love where it could not be helped.'" One of the Mrs. Harbins sighed, possibly from admiration. Lydia looked at the lilies, white, expensive, funereal in the wrong light. Elspeth had always known how to choose a symbol that did her own character credit. "How thoughtful," Lydia said. "She has sent flowers suitable for burying what she did." Lady Teversham made a distressed sound. "My dear, bitterness will only injure you." "Then I shall use accuracy instead." Lady Marwen's eyes flickered with approval, but the callers shifted. They had come prepared for tears. Perhaps for noble forgiveness, perhaps for a trembling confession that Miss Loxley had been irresistible and Mr. Mowbray merely human. They had not come prepared for grammar. The door opened again. This time the footman announced Mrs. Mowbray, Rupert's aunt. The older woman entered in plum silk, carrying her injury before her like a second reticule. She did not sit until Lady Marwen permitted it. She did not look at the lilies. She looked directly at Lydia's wrist. "Lady Lydia," she said, "this is painful beyond expression." "For whom, Mrs. Mowbray?" A faint colour rose in the woman's cheeks. "For all families concerned." Rupert acted from an excess of honesty. "It was most unfortunate in timing, but there are matters of the heart one cannot command. Apparently there are also matters of the breakfast table one cannot command." Mrs. Mowbray's lips thinned. "I had hoped we might settle certain practicalities with dignity. Gifts, notes, tokens of attachment. Such things should be returned promptly, lest they suggest claims that no longer exist. Anything belonging to Mr. Mowbray will be returned, and anything not properly belonging elsewhere." The sentence settled with a soft, poisonous weight. Lydia looked up. The room seemed to draw closer again, as it had in the winter garden. "Elsewhere, I speak only from delicacy. Rupert was generous during the courtship. Young ladies sometimes attach sentiment to objects that are, in strictness, part of an understanding between families." Lady Marwen's fan snapped shut. "If you refer to my niece's bracelet, you are either misinformed or impertinent." Mrs. Mowbray raised her brows. "I refer to nothing specifically. Yet I have heard that some confusion exists regarding jewels recently altered and whether all such ornaments are heirlooms in the manner described." The coral cameo seemed to grow heavier on Lydia's wrist, so this was the next shape of the lie. Not merely that Rupert had followed helpless love, not merely that Lydia had understood. Now the last gift from her mother was being nudged into doubt, made common, made transactional, made possibly his. Lydia thought of Elspeth's fingers pressing the clasp. She thought of the replaced register page. She thought of the sealed chain under Lady Marwen's wax. She could not yet prove what had been arranged. But she could refuse the language prepared for her. "Mrs. Mowbray," she said, "a woman may lose a fiancé and still retain her own name." The older woman stared. Lydia continued, her voice quiet enough that everyone had to listen. "She may also retain her mother's bracelet, her memory, and her right not to have another family inventory, her grief, as if it were plate." No one moved. Lady Teversham looked at her lap. One of the Mrs. Harbin forgot to pretend she was not delighted. Mrs. Mowbray drew herself up. You take a sharp tone for a lady in a precarious position. No, Lydia said. I take a clear one. Before Mrs. Mowbray could reply, the footman announced His Grace, the Duke of North-wick. If the room had been hungry before, it became ravenous now. Gervase Fenton entered with the same controlled authority he had carried beneath the glass roof. But today there was no shock in his arrival. His card had been sent ahead. His visit was formal, proper, and timed with a precision that suggested he had known the morning would require witnesses. He bowed first to Lady Marwen, then to Lydia. His eyes passed once over the lilies, once over Mrs. Mowbray, and came to rest on Lydia's face. He did not look at her wrist. That restraint, after Mrs. Mowbray's pointed stare, felt almost like shelter. Lady Lydia, he said. Lady Marwen, I hope I do not intrude. On the contrary, Lady Marwen replied. We were just being educated in the flexible ownership of heirlooms. Mrs. Mowbray flushed deeply. The Duke took the chair offered to him only after Lydia had inclined her head. He did not dominate the center of the room. He placed himself beside, not before, her line of sight. How fortunate, he said. I have always preferred precise records to flexible memory. Lydia felt the corner of her mouth threaten to move. She stopped it, but not before his gaze warmed faintly. Mrs. Mowbray rose. I did not come to be insulted by implication. Then you were wise not to speak more plainly, the Duke said. Plain speech requires plain proof. She had no answer for that. Her departure forced several lesser sympathizers to depart with her. Like leaves taken by the same gust. Within minutes, the drawing-room, emptied of all but Lady Marwen, Lydia, the Duke, and the lilies, which looked more foolish now than mournful. Lydia remained seated until the last carriage rolled away. Only then did she let her shoulders loosen by a fraction. You arrived at a convenient moment, Your Grace. Convenience had very little to do with it. Then calculation, sum. She looked at him. He met the look without apology. I was told Mrs. Mowbray had called. I thought she would not come empty-handed. She came with insinuations. They are cheaper than evidence. The words should have sounded cold. Instead, they steadied her. Lydia looked down at the cameo. They mean to question the bracelet. Yes, because Elspeth touched it. Because someone needs your mother's memory to become uncertain. That sentence struck the room softly and stayed there. Lydia swallowed once. I will not let them have it. No, he said. I do not think you will. There was admiration in the words, but not the easy kind offered to soothe a woman after distress. It was specific, earned. He had watched her answer for herself, and he had not interrupted. He had brought rank into the room and kept it leashed until she had finished speaking. Lydia found that more dangerous to her composure than if he had swept in and silenced them all. After a moment, he said quietly, They expected fracture. You gave them steel. The words entered her like warmth through a closed door. She looked at him, and for one unguarded instant, the morning's exhaustion, anger, and grief all stood visible between them. Steel bends, she said, only before it breaks. His voice gentled, though his posture did not. Then we must make certain the pressure falls where it belongs. Lady Marwen rose to answer another discreet knock at the door. She returned with a folded notice. Her expression changed. From a Bond Street jeweller. Lydia's hand closed over the cameo before she could stop herself. The Duke did look at her wrist now, not with curiosity, but with recognition of pain. Lady Marwen read aloud. The jeweller claimed that a coral cameo bracelet in Lady Lydia Staveley's name had been recently altered, its clasp replaced, and its original chain removed by request. The room went silent. Lydia felt the red mark beneath her glove pulse once. The lilies gave off their sweet, suffocating scent. The Duke's face became very still. "Now," he said, "they have made their first mistake." The notice from the Bond Street jeweller did not leave Lydia's thoughts for 3 days. It followed her through breakfast, through the careful silence of servants, through Lady Marwen's brisk instructions to have no visitor admitted without approval, and through the uneasy hours in which Staveley House seemed to hold its breath between one rumour and the next. By the third afternoon, when the carriage drew up before North-wick House in Grosvenor Square, Lydia had read the notice so often that its wording felt carved into her mind. A coral cameo bracelet in Lady Lydia Staveley's name had been recently altered. The clasp had been replaced. The original safety chain had been removed by request. By request. That was the phrase that wounded most. It made the theft sound obedient. It made the damage sound like her own choice. Lady Marwen descended first, sharp-eyed and upright in dark silk, then turned back to Lydia. "Remember," she said, low enough that the footman could not hear, "we are here because truth was summoned, not because shame was." Lydia nodded and stepped down. Her bracelet, wrapped now in a square of soft muslin, rested inside a small velvet case in her reticule. She had hated removing it from her wrist that morning. But the clasp had begun to catch against her glove, and the Duke had written that the hinge must be examined without risking further damage. The broken gold safety chain was not with her. It remained sealed in Lady Marwen's travelling writing case, as agreed, until it could be compared before proper witnesses. North-wick House was grand without being showy, all pale stone, polished brass, and windows that seemed to reflect the square with quiet judgment. Inside, a butler led them not to a drawing-room, arranged for courtship, but to a library where a long table had been cleared beneath high shelves of leather-bound volumes. It was a room built for records, not flirtation. Lydia was grateful for that. Romance, if it existed at all in this strange arrangement, could not be allowed to blur the line between sympathy and proof. The Duke stood when they entered. So did the older gentleman beside him, a narrow man with silver spectacles and a solicitor's black coat. Lady Lydia, Lady Marwen. Gervase bowed first to the aunt, then to Lydia, and again she noticed that he waited for her acknowledgement before speaking further. "Mr. Wexford has brought the jeweller's copied ledger and the notice sent to your house. The original ledger remains at the shop for now. I thought it better not to remove it before we understand who may ask after it." Lydia felt the first small thread of approval tightened inside her. He had not seized the evidence. He had preserved its place. "That was wise," she said. "I hoped you would think so." The answer was quiet, almost dry, but there was a trace of warmth beneath it that made her look away too quickly. Lady Marwen took the chair closest to Lydia. Mr. Wexford arranged several papers on the table, each weighted by a small brass ruler. Lydia set the velvet case before her, but did not open it yet. The Duke did not reach for it. He simply waited. She found that waiting more unsettling than command would have been. Mr. Wexford cleared his throat. "The ledger entry is dated 2 days before the betrothal breakfast. It records a request for clasp replacement, removal of old safety chain, and polishing of coral cameo frame. The name given was Lady Lydia Staveley." "I gave no such request," Lydia said. Her voice sounded calm. She took strength from it. "I had not visited that jeweller in more than a year." "The signature is here," Mr. Wexford said, turning the copied page. Lydia looked. For one instant disgust rose so sharply she could taste it. The hand was similar to hers. Similar enough to fool anyone who wished to be fooled. The capital L had her loop. The Staveley had nearly the same slope, but the final letter thinned incorrectly, as if the writer had copied the shape without understanding the habit behind it. "It is not mine." "No," the Duke said. Lydia looked at him. He had spoken without hesitation. "You are certain?" she asked. "I have seen your writing only twice," he said. "Once on the note you sent agreeing to this meeting, and once on the list of conditions you gave me in Lady Marwen's morning room. You cross your T with more pressure when the word concerns a decision. This signature does not." Lady Marwen stared at him over the rim of her spectacles. "That is a rather particular observation, Your Grace. Particulars are where lies fail." Lydia should have felt exposed by his attention to her handwriting. Instead, she felt steadied by the fact that he had noticed the force of her decisions and not merely the elegance of her hand. Mr. Wexford turned another page. "There is also this, a duplicate alteration order, folded beneath the copied entry when the jeweller's assistant transcribed it for us. It bears the same name, but the ink is darker, and the requested removal of the original chain is underlined." "Underlined," Lady Marwen said, as if urgency were being performed. "Or instructed," the Duke replied. Lydia opened the velvet case. The coral cameo lay in its muslin bed, innocent and altered, the carved woman's profile facing upward as though she were listening to the accusations around her. Lydia lifted it carefully. Without the safety chain, the bracelet looked incomplete, though anyone unfamiliar with it might have missed the absence. "My mother wore this in her last portrait," Lydia said. "The chain is visible against her glove." It was not decorative. She had it added after the clasp failed at a county dinner and the bracelet nearly fell. "Then there should be a record of that older repair," the Duke said. "There is," Lady Marwen answered, "in my sister's account book. I will send it under seal." Lydia turned the bracelet, so the clasp faced the light. The hinge did look newer. She hated that she had not seen it sooner. She hated more that Elspeth perhaps had. "May I examine it?" the Duke asked. He asked the question of Lydia, not Mr. Wexford, not Lady Marwen. Lydia placed the bracelet on the muslin and slid it toward him. He bent over it, but did not touch it until she nodded. His hands, gloved in dark leather, were precise. He turned the bracelet slightly, then stopped. "The hinge is too bright." Mr. Wexford leaned in. "Yes, Your Grace. The soldering also lacks the patina of the older setting." "So the clasp was replaced," Lydia said. "Or recently disturbed enough to appear replaced," the Duke said. "We must not outrun the proof. It might have been condescending from another man. From him, it sounded like protection of the truth, rather than denial of her pain." Then his gaze moved from the clasp to her wrist. Lydia had removed her glove from that hand before leaving home, because the bracelet had caught the kid and pulled at the skin. The faint red mark remained near the pulse, less livid now but still visible. The Duke's expression changed, barely. "The clasp left that?" he asked. Lydia almost covered it. Pride moved first, then memory. He had never taken what she had not offered. "Yes." His hand stayed on the table. "May I?" The room seemed to narrow around the question. Lady Marwen was there. Mr. Wexford was there. Sunlight lay respectably on the papers. Nothing improper existed except the strange new awareness that his attention had become gentler than his voice. Lydia extended her wrist. "You may." He touched her as one might handle a page that could tear if pressed too hard. Two gloved fingers turned her hand toward the light, no more than necessary, no longer than propriety allowed. Yet the contact moved through Lydia. with a quiet force because it contained no claim. He did not hold her. He examined the mark, saw it, and released her before she had to decide whether to withdraw. The pressure came from the side of the clasp, he said, his voice lower, not from ordinary wear. Lydia drew her hand back slowly. Her skin remembered the warmth of his glove after it was gone, meaning someone either forced it shut or forced it open. The bracelet on the table seemed suddenly less like a jewel than a witness too frightened to speak. Lady Marwen's mouth tightened. Miss Loxley adjusted it. In full view of the room, Lydia said. Yes, because who would suspect tenderness? The Duke looked at her then, and for the first time that afternoon, his control seemed touched by anger. Not loud anger, not theatrical anger, the kind that waits because it intends to be useful. We will ask the jeweller who brought the order, he said. Lydia shook her head once. Not we. He went still. She held his gaze, though it cost her something. Not if that means I sit in this room while gentlemen carry my mother's bracelet from witness to witness. I will go with my aunt. You may send Mr. Wexford. You may ask questions after I have asked mine. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Duke inclined his head. Agreed. Lady Marwen breathed out through her nose, almost amused. Again, very quick agreement. Lady Lydia is right again. This time, Lydia did not look away fast enough to hide the effect of his words. His admiration did not soften the danger. It strengthened her against it. Mr. Wexford gathered the papers, but before he could stack the duplicate order, the Duke stopped him with one finger near the edge. There, a tiny smear marked the fold, darker than the surrounding ink. Mr. Wexford adjusted his spectacles. Same ink as the underlining, perhaps. Lydia leaned closer. The smear meant little by itself, yet it had survived because someone careless had folded urgency into paper. Can it be compared with the register page? She asked. The Duke looked at her, and now the faint warmth returned. That was my next question. Then I am relieved to have arrived before it. As am I. The words were formal. The room was proper. Still, something passed between them that was neither proposal nor gratitude. It was the first shape of partnership. Mr. Wexford placed the duplicate order into a fresh envelope and marked it. The bracelet returned to Lydia's velvet case. The red mark at her wrist cooled in the open air. As Lady Marwen rose, a footman entered with a note for the Duke, delivered from the jeweller's shop. Gervase read it once, and his face became unreadable again. The jeweller confirms a lady came veiled, he said, but his apprentice remembers pale green gloves. Lydia's hand closed over the velvet case. In the winter garden, Elspeth had worn pale green gloves when she touched the bracelet. None of them said her name. They did not need to. The coral cameo lay silent in Lydia's reticule, but the first witness had begun to speak. The opera house had been built for display. But that evening, Lydia understood it was also built for judgment. Every tier of boxes glowed beneath chandeliers, each gilt rail crowded with gloved hands, jeweled throats, tilted fans, and eyes that turned before the orchestra had finished tuning. London had not forgotten the betrothal breakfast. London had embroidered it. By the time Lady Marwen's carriage stopped beneath the lamps, Lydia had heard 3 versions of her own disgrace from people careful enough not to repeat them directly to her face. In one, Rupert had followed true love after years of patient suffering. In another, Lydia had accepted the Duke of North-wick's offer on the spot and was merely pretending uncertainty to appear delicate. In the newest and ugliest version, her mother's coral cameo bracelet had not been an heirloom at all, but a recent ornament altered under her name to suggest sentimental consequence where none existed. That rumor had not yet grown teeth, but Lydia could feel them forming. The bracelet was not on her wrist tonight. It lay in its velvet case at Staveley House, wrapped in muslin and watched over by Lady Marwen's maid as though it were an invalid. The broken safety chain remained sealed in Lady Marwen's red wax. The jeweller's copied ledger and duplicate alteration order were with Mr. Wexford. The facts were separated, witnessed, and preserved. Lydia repeated that to herself as the footman opened the carriage door. Facts could wait. Society never did. Remember, Lady Marwen said, adjusting one black glove, no woman ever died from being looked at, though several have been tempted to make the attempt. Lydia almost smiled. I shall try to disappoint them by surviving. Do more than survive. Sit where they can see you. The Duke of North-wick was waiting inside the entrance hall, not at the foot of the carriage, like a lover in a sentimental print, but beneath a marble column where propriety could approve him, and gossip could not improve upon him. His bow to Lady Marwen came first. His bow to Lydia came next. Only then did his eyes rest on her face. He took in the dark blue gown, the pearl comb Lady Marwen had insisted upon, the absence of the coral bracelet, and the composure she had fastened over herself more tightly than any jewel. He said nothing about courage. She was grateful. Lady Lydia, he said, your aunt has instructed me that retreat is not among the evening's acceptable movements. My aunt gives military orders in silk. I have begun to suspect as much. Lady Marwen moved ahead with the satisfaction of a commander whose troops had shown promise. The Duke offered his arm to her first, as rank and age required, then guided both ladies toward the North-wick box. Lydia noticed how carefully he did it. He did not hurry her past observers, as if she must be hidden. He did not slow to make spectacle of her, as if she were a banner raised against Rupert. He simply walked at a pace that made every stare irrelevant. By the time they reached the box, half the house knew His Grace had brought Lady Lydia Staveley to the opera. By the time Lydia sat at the front rail beside Lady Marwen, the other half was pretending not to know. The first act passed in a blur of music and awareness. Lydia heard the soprano's grief rise above the orchestra, but beneath it she heard fans shifting in neighboring boxes. At the interval, the true performance began. Guests leaned outward. Gentlemen lifted opera glasses. Ladies found reasons to turn. Then, across the curve of the house, Lydia saw Elspeth. Miss Elspeth Loxley sat in a box draped in crimson, pale and lovely under candlelight, with Rupert Mowbray behind her chair. Her gown was a soft green that made her complexion luminous. Her gloves were pale green as well. Lydia's breath caught before she could prevent it. The same shade, perhaps not the same pair from the breakfast. Perhaps, but memory supplied the image of those fingers at her wrist, pressing the clasp, murmuring that she must look perfect today. Then Elspeth lifted her hand to adjust her fan, and Lydia saw the bracelet. Not coral, not cameo, a narrow gold bracelet with a clasp of distinctive shape, too small to be noticed by most, too familiar now for Lydia to dismiss. The clasp curved like a folded leaf. It resembled the setting where her mother's safety chain had once joined the bracelet. The opera house seemed to recede. Lydia did not move. The Duke, standing just behind her chair, spoke without leaning too near. You have seen something. She kept her gaze forward. Her clasp. Yes. The single word told her he had seen it too, not imagined, not invented from pain. Seen. It may be nothing, Lydia said. It may be something made to look like nothing. She turned then, and his expression held anger under restraint. It comforted her more than fury would have done. Fury demanded action. Restraint promised usefulness. Lady Marwen's fan opened. Miss Loxley is coming. Elspeth entered the North-wick box, with permission gained through a neighbouring lady, and with Rupert hovering just beyond the threshold. Uncertain whether he dared follow, she dipped a curtsy to the Duke, then turned to Lydia, with eyes bright enough for anyone watching to call them tender. "Lydia, I'm so relieved to see you out. I feared you might hide yourself away after everything. How kind," Lydia said. "You always feared the most dramatic possibility." Elspeth's smile trembled. "I only meant that grief can make one cling to painful symbols." Her gaze dropped to Lydia's bare wrist. "You are not wearing the cameo. No, perhaps that's wise. Old jewels can grow heavy when new titles are offered." The insult was wrapped so delicately that a careless listener might have mistaken it for concern. Lydia felt the Duke's stillness behind her. She knew he could end the conversation with one sentence. He did not. He waited. He had promised not to answer where she could speak. Lydia folded her hands in her lap. "Titles cannot replace truth, Elspeth." Elspeth's lashes flickered. "Truth? Dearest, the truth is that affection changed. It's painful, but it isn't a crime." "No," Lydia said. "Changing affection is not a crime. Preparing a room so that one woman learns it before witnesses is not affection either." Rupert's face darkened at the threshold. "Lady Lydia, this is hardly the place." "That did not trouble you yesterday morning." A nearby gentleman turned sharply away, pretending sudden fascination with the stage curtain. Lady Marwen's fan hid nothing of her satisfaction. Elspeth recovered first. "You are letting bitterness guide you. I don't blame you. Truly, I don't. But when this fever passes, you'll see that no one wished you harm." Lydia looked at the gold clasp on Elspeth's wrist. "Then everyone has been remarkably clumsy in avoiding it." The Duke's voice entered at last, cool and formal. "Miss Loxley, the next act will begin shortly." It was dismissal shaped as courtesy. Elspeth had no choice but to curtsy. As she turned, the candlelight caught the clasp again. The Duke saw it. Lydia saw him see it. Rupert took Elspeth's arm with too much haste, and they withdrew beneath a cloud of whispers that seemed to follow them, like perfume gone sour. Lydia remained seated until the curtain stirred. Only then did she rise enough to stand at the rail, needing air that did not smell of wax and judgment. The Duke stepped beside her, careful to leave a proper distance. Below, musicians shifted in the pit. Above, society pretended to look at the stage while watching them instead. Lydia rested one gloved hand on the velvet rail. "I thought I was prepared." "For Miss Loxley, for being looked at. No one is prepared to be misread by design." The words were quiet enough to belong only to the space between them. Lydia turned her head. "You speak as if from experience." Something closed in his face, not coldness. "Perhaps I do." She did not press. Not here. Not with 100 opera glasses, waiting to turn pain into entertainment. Instead, she looked forward again. For one brief moment, as the lamps lowered and the house dimmed, her gloved hand shifted along the rail. His moved at the same time. Their fingers brushed. The contact was slight, accidental, nothing more than kid leather against kid leather. Yet both of them stilled. Lydia did not pull away in alarm. He did not catch her hand. The pause lasted only a breath, but within it lay an awareness sharper than anything spoken that evening. Then the Duke withdrew by the smallest measure, giving her room before room was needed. "Forgive me," he said softly. "There's nothing to forgive." The orchestra began again. Lydia sat with her heart not healed, not safe, but steadier, across the opera house. Elspeth's pale green gloves gleamed in the candlelight. and the wrong clasp on her wrist waited like a clue, bold enough to believe itself invisible. The charity jewel inspection was meant to be harmless. That was how Lady Marwen described it, while fastening her bonnet 2 mornings after the opera, though her tone suggested that harmlessness, like innocence, often failed when too many respectable people were invited to observe it. The event had been arranged in a hired assembly room near St. James's, a patronage display for widows of tradesmen who had fallen into hardship after their husbands' shops failed, and several ladies had lent family jewels to be catalogued and praised before subscriptions were collected. Under ordinary circumstances, Lydia would have admired the purpose and mistrusted the performance. That morning she did both, while stepping from Lady Marwen's carriage, with the velvet case in her reticule and a steady expression she had practiced before the mirror until it no longer looked practiced. The coral cameo bracelet was with her again. The Duke's solicitor had advised that hiding it would feed the rumour more quickly than producing it. The broken safety chain remained sealed under Lady Marwen's red wax. The copied jeweller's ledger and duplicate alteration order remained with Mr. Wexford. The bracelet itself, however, must appear, because the whispered question had become public enough to demand a visible answer. Inside, the room gleamed with polished cases, velvet trays, silver labels, and charitable smiles. Society had learned to make accusation look like benevolence. Lydia felt it the moment she entered. Conversation did not stop. It thinned. It bent toward her. At the far end of the room, Mr. Percival Vale, the attending jeweller engaged by the committee, stood behind a long table with his spectacles low on his nose and a ledger open before him. Lydia remembered his name from the notice. He was not the Bond Street jeweller whose ledger had been copied, but he had been asked to verify several heirlooms and provide professional comments for the subscription record. That made him useful to whoever wanted public doubt without public responsibility. Elspeth Loxley stood near a glass case of garnets, pale as a devotional portrait, her hands folded modestly. She wore no bracelet today. That absence was more revealing than display. Rupert Mowbray stood beside her, not touching, but close enough to assure the room he had not abandoned tenderness, only rearranged it. When Lydia approached the inspection table with Lady Marwen on one side and the Duke of North-wick on the other, she heard a woman whisper, "How brave of her to bring it!" Another whispered, "Or bold." Lydia did not turn. Bold was what cowards called a woman who did not hide when they had prepared a shadow for her. Mr. Vale bowed. "Lady Lydia, Your Grace, Lady Marwen, the committee is honoured." Lady Marwen placed her reticule on the edge of the table. "Then the committee may begin by being accurate." The jeweller coloured slightly. Lydia opened the velvet case herself. The cameo lay against muslin, its carved profile warm and familiar, the clasp hinge faintly brighter than the old gold around it. For one moment, grief touched her so unexpectedly that she nearly closed the lid again. She saw her mother's wrist, slender and gloved, turning in lamplight. She heard the old murmur, "Carry tenderness where the world expects ornament." Then she lifted the bracelet and placed it on the velvet tray. "This belonged to my mother, Lady Staveley." Mr. Vale bent over it. His hesitation came almost at once. It was a small pause, but small pauses were knives in polite rooms. Lydia felt it ripple outward before anyone spoke. The jeweller adjusted his spectacles. "A handsome cameo." "Not handsome," Lady Marwen said, identified. Mr. Vale swallowed. "Yes, of course. There is, however, a matter of alteration." The word carried. It was meant to carry. Elspeth lowered her eyes. Rupert's mouth tightened with the sorrow of a man waiting for tragedy he had helped arrange. The Duke stood very still. "Alteration is not in itself remarkable," Lydia said. "Old jewels are repaired." "Certainly." Mr. Vale turned the bracelet with a small tool. "Yet the clasp is recent, and there appears to be some question whether the present setting corresponds to the family description supplied." A murmur lifted. Lydia kept her gaze on the bracelet. If she looked at the room, she might begin to answer every face. Better to answer the lie. "The original safety chain was removed without my consent." Mr. Vale's fingers paused. "I cannot speak to consent, Lady Lydia. I can only speak to the work. Then speak only to that." The room quieted by half. The Duke did not intervene. Lydia felt him near, a controlled force at her side. But he kept his promise. He let her voice stand first. Mr. Vale looked uncomfortable now, which meant some part of him had expected embarrassment, not precision. "There is a ledger reference, I understand, to a request made under your name." "Under my name is not by my hand." Elspeth stepped forward just enough to be seen. "Lydia, no one wants to distress you. Truly, we don't, but perhaps in all this confusion, some instruction was misunderstood." "By whom?" Lydia asked. Elspeth's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly know. Yet you seem very certain distress is the chief danger here." Rupert spoke then, smooth with false reluctance. "Ambition can make any of us appear unlike ourselves. I feared it had changed you even before yesterday's unfortunate display." The room absorbed the sentence greedily. There it was, shaped at last. Lydia had lost Rupert because she had set her sights higher. Lydia had altered a jewel to create sentimental theatre. Lydia had turned abandonment into strategy. For one cold second, she could almost admire the elegance of the trap. It used the Duke's public offer as proof against her. It made rescue look like motive. It made her mother's bracelet bait. The Duke's hand moved at his side. He wanted to speak. Lydia sensed it before she saw it. She turned her head very slightly. Not enough for society to notice, enough for him. Wait. His jaw tightened, but he obeyed. That obedience steadied her more than his anger could have done. She turned back to Rupert. "You feared ambition had changed me? I grieve to say it." "Then you grieve easily." A faint sound crossed the room, part shock, part suppressed satisfaction. Lydia placed her fingertips near the velvet tray, not touching the bracelet, only claiming the space around it. "Mr. Vale, did you see the lady who gave the alteration order?" The jeweller hesitated. "I did not personally receive her." "Did your shop?" The matter was handled by an assistant at the Bond Street establishment from which the notice originated. "I have seen the copied reference only." "Then your hesitation today is not based on your own knowledge of my bracelet's history. It is based on professional irregularity." "A useful phrase," Lydia said. "It sounds almost like proof." Mr. Vale flushed. The Duke looked at her then, and though his face remained composed, she felt the force of his approval like a hand at her back. Not pushing, supporting. Lady Marwen lifted her chin. "The bracelet will remain available for proper comparison with family accounts and the sealed chain in my possession. It will not be converted into gossip by committee murmuring." "Of course," Mr. Vale said quickly. But the damage had been done. Lydia could feel it moving already through the room. Ladies would repeat that the jeweller had hesitated. Gentlemen would say the Duke looked grave. Elspeth would lower her eyes and forgive Lydia for suffering. Rupert would sigh over ambition. Lydia closed the velvet case herself. She did not tremble until she was in the carriage. Even then, the trembling was small and private, mostly in the hand that had carried her mother's bracelet through a room determined to make it false. Lady Marwen sat opposite, rigid with contained fury. The Duke sat beside Lydia only because the carriage was his and propriety allowed it with Lady Marwen present. For several minutes, the wheels over the stones were the only sound. Then he said, "I should have stopped it." Lydia looked through the carriage window at the passing fronts of London houses. If you had stopped it, they would say, "I could not endure examination." They accused you in charitable language. Yes, that does not make it less vicious. She turned then. His anger was no longer hidden, but it was held carefully, like a blade kept low in a crowded room. It was for her, not for his pride. That difference mattered. "Did Mr. Vale give you anything useful?" she asked. Names of committee witnesses. Confirmation that the public hesitation was prompted by a copied ledger he did not originate, and proof that someone wanted the question asked in a room full of subscribers. So the trap worked. Partly, only partly. The Duke looked at her hand where it rested, bare of bracelet, on the dark carriage seat. He did not take it. He opened his own hand, palm upward, in the space between them. An offer, nothing more. Lydia stared at it for one breath, then another. The morning's humiliation pressed against her ribs. Her mother's memory had been handled by strangers. Her own name had been made slippery in the mouths of women who called themselves charitable. She could refuse comfort and remain dignified. She could accept it and remain herself. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with no force at all. Warmth moved through the kid leather, modest and astonishing. Lady Marwen looked out the window with sudden, pointed interest. The Duke did not speak for a long moment. Neither did Lydia. The hand-holding lasted through one street, then another. Then the turn toward Mayfair, long enough to become a choice rather than an accident. At last he said, very low, "They have mistaken your silence for weakness twice now." Lydia's fingers tightened once in his. "Then we must become better teachers." He looked at her, and something in his eyes softened beyond strategy. Before either of them could say more, a rider approached the carriage and passed a folded message through the small window to the Duke's footman. The Duke read it while still holding Lydia's hand, then went utterly still. "What is it?" Lady Marwen asked. His gaze moved from the paper to Lydia. "Mr. Wexford has compared the copied jeweller's order with the replaced register page." Lydia felt the carriage seem to pause around her, though the horses continued. "And the ink appears to be the same." Lydia looked down at their joined hands, then at the case in her lap that held the questioned cameo. Her humiliation had not been an accident, not a failed romance, not the overflow of inconvenient love. It had been prepared in ink, in metal, in paper, and in rooms full of witnesses. She did not pull her hand from the Duke's. Not yet. The road ahead had darkened, but for the first time since the chain fell beneath the winter garden table, she was not holding the truth alone. By the second afternoon after the charity inspection, Lydia learned that power could be gentle in the morning and dangerous by dusk. It began with a note that should never have reached her. Lady Marwen had gone upstairs to speak with Lord Staveley about refusing any further visits from Mrs. Mowbray, and Lydia sat alone in the small drawing-room with the coral cameo case open before her. The bracelet lay against its muslin. Old gold, dulled by years of touch, the newer clasp too bright now that she knew to distrust it. She had not worn it since the inspection. She had wanted to, if only to prove that public doubt did not command her wrist. But the hinge caught whenever she moved it, and the faint red mark near her pulse had not entirely faded. The sealed safety chain remained in Lady Marwen's writing case. Mr. Wexford held the copied ledger and duplicate alteration order. The replaced register page was under guarded examination. Everything had its place. That orderliness had been Lydia's one comfort. Then the footman entered with a folded letter on a tray and said it had been delivered for Lady Marwen from North-wick House. "Her ladyship is with my father," Lydia said. "I will take it to her." The footman bowed and withdrew. Lydia did not mean to read it. She saw only the direction first, then the broken seal. It had opened in transit, perhaps caught under another packet. The top sheet shifted as she lifted it, and a line of Mr. Wexford's precise hand appeared before she could look away. "His Grace believes a private retraction from the jeweller, accompanied by the surrender or destruction of the duplicate order, may prevent further injury to Lady Lydia's maternal reputation." The words did not strike at once. They entered quietly, almost reasonably, and then spread cold through her. Private retraction, surrender or destruction, prevent further injury. Lydia stood so abruptly that the note slid from her hand to the carpet. The coral cameo lay open on the table, innocent and altered. Her mother's profile seemed to look past her, as if the dead had already learned that the living often buried truth in the name of peace. She picked up the letter with fingers that did not tremble until the second sentence. "If this course is chosen, the public question may be allowed to fade rather than be answered in a larger forum." Allowed to fade. Lydia heard the jewel room again. The whisper, bold. The pause from Mr. Vale. Rupert's smooth grief, Elspeth's lowered lashes. Ambition can make any of us appear unlike ourselves. If the evidence faded, the accusation would not. It would remain, softened into rumor, impossible to answer, because no one would admit to having heard it clearly. She went to the window and saw a North-wick carriage turning into the squares. Of course, he was coming to explain, or worse, to persuade. Lydia folded the note, placed it on the table beside the open cameo case, and removed the courtship ring from her right hand. It was a restrained ring, a square sapphire set in old gold, sent formally through Lady Marwen after the opera as a visible token of the provisional courtship. Lydia had accepted it because its meaning had been witnessed, limited, and honest. Now it felt heavier than the bracelet. When Gervase Fenton was shown in, he stopped just inside the room. Lady Marwen had returned by then and sat near the hearth with the expression of a woman who had read the same note and found herself restraining several generations of family temper. The Duke bowed to her, then to Lydia. His gaze moved to the table. He saw the letter. He saw the ring. For the first time since she had known him, his stillness looked less like control than alarm. "Lady Lydia," he said, "I had intended to speak with you before any decision was made, but after the solution had been shaped." He did not deny it. After it had been considered. Considered by whom? By me. By Mr. Wexford. Not by me, no. The honesty should have helped. It did not. Lydia placed her hand lightly on the back of the chair before her. She would not sit. Sitting would make this a conference. It was not. It was a boundary. You meant to pay the jeweller to retract. To compel a retraction if possible. With money, with influence first. How comforting. Influence leaves cleaner fingerprints. Lady Marwen's eyes flashed, but she remained silent. The Duke took the blow without flinching. "I was trying to prevent your mother's bracelet from being dragged through another public room." Lydia looked at the cameo case. "My mother's bracelet has already been dragged through a public room. So have I. The only question remaining is whether the truth will follow us there or be locked in your solicitor's drawer. That is not what I want. Then, what do you want?" His jaw tightened. I want them stopped before they make your grief a spectacle. They already made my grief a spectacle. You would make me safe by making me silent. The sentence landed between them with a force that changed the air. The Duke looked as though she had named something he had not allowed himself to see. Lydia wished that were enough. It was not. The duplicate order is evidence, she said. The ledger is evidence. The register page is evidence. The chain is evidence. If one piece is surrendered or destroyed for the sake of quiet, then the next person who says I altered my mother's bracelet will be able to smile and say no proof was ever shown. I would not allow that. You cannot stand in every drawing room in England. No, but I can make certain the people who matter understand. Lydia almost laughed, but it would have sounded too much like pain. The people who matter, that is what rank always says, when it means the people who can be managed. What of the women at the inspection who whispered? What of the shop assistants who heard my name attached to a false order? What of every person Rupert can sigh to over dinner? Do they not matter because they cannot damage you? His face changed then. Not with anger, with something worse. Recognition. He had reached for protection and found power in his hand. Lady Lydia, he said quietly, I did not mean to diminish your injury. Intention is not absolution. No, the word came at once, low and grave. It is not. That should have softened her. A little of it did, and she hated that too, because tenderness made anger harder to hold and more necessary to keep honest. He took one step forward, then stopped. His gaze fell to her bare hand where the sapphire ring no longer rested. May I ask whether the ring is being returned? Yes. Lady Marwen's fan stilled. Lydia picked up the ring and crossed the room only far enough to place it on the small table between them. She did not put it into his hand. She could not bear the touch just then. Not after the carriage. Not after the warmth of his palm had made her believe partnership might be simple. I am not ending the courtship, she said, but I will not wear a token of trust while you are deciding which truths may be permitted to survive me. The Duke's face went very pale beneath its composure. That is just. It is painful. Those are often the same thing. She looked at him then, and the quiet devastation in his voice nearly undid her. He did not protest. He did not remind her of what he had done in the winter garden. He did not claim that public offers and carriage comfort should earn him leniency. He simply accepted the consequence. That acceptance hurt more than argument would have done. He moved as if to reach for her hand, perhaps from instinct, perhaps because he remembered too clearly that she had once placed it in his. Then he stopped himself before his fingers crossed the space. The restraint was visible. So was the cost. I have wronged you, he said, not beyond repair, perhaps, but enough that repair must begin with obedience to your boundary. Lydia's throat tightened. She wanted to say something sharp enough to protect herself from how much that mattered. Instead, she said, then obey this one. No private burial, no purchased silence, no destroyed evidence. Agreed. Not because I am right again and you admire it. His eyes lifted. No, because this time, if you stand beside me, you must stand beside the truth, even when it wounds me. Yes. For a moment, the room held all the things they did not say, that he had frightened her, that she had begun to trust him, that the return of a small sapphire ring could hurt almost as much as the loss of a fiancé, because this time she had hoped better of the man. Lady Marwen rose at last, slow and deliberate. His Grace will leave the ring here for now. I shall keep it until my niece chooses otherwise. The Duke bowed, as Lady Lydia wishes. Lydia looked down at the coral cameo. Tomorrow I am going to the Bond Street jeweller." His gaze sharpened. "Then I will send a carriage and men to watch the street." "You may send a carriage. You may not send men into the shop ahead of me." "I will ask my questions first." A pause. Then, softer, "Yes." He left soon after, the sapphire ring still on Lady Marwen's table and the misdirected note folded beside it. Lydia did not watch from the window. She stood over her mother's bracelet and closed the velvet case with care. The click of the lid sounded small, final, not the end of trust, but the end of being protected like a thing too fragile to hold its own truth. The next morning, London seemed determined to behave as though truth were merely another appointment. Carriages rolled along Bond Street with their usual glossy indifference. Shop windows displayed ribbons, gloves, fans, silk flowers, and small jeweled temptations arranged for women whose reputations had not been recently handled like questionable merchandise. Lydia sat beside Lady Marwen in the carriage with her hands folded over her reticule and the coral cameo bracelet inside its velvet case. The courtship ring was not on her finger. It remained on Lady Marwen's table, where she had placed it, after returning it to the Duke without placing it in his hand. That absence had followed her all morning, not with regret exactly, but with an ache sharper than pride wanted to admit. The Duke had sent his carriage as permitted. He had sent no gentleman into the shop ahead of her. 2 North-wick footmen stood discreetly across the street, far enough to avoid command, near enough to discourage interference. That obedience steadied her before she ever stepped down. He had listened, at least in this. Listening did not repair trust. It gave repair a door. Lady Marwen touched Lydia's wrist lightly before the footman opened the door. "Ask what you came to ask. Do not let them answer the question they prefer." "That sounds like something you should have taught me before my first season." "I did. You were too busy pretending optimism was a useful strategy." Lydia almost laughed, and that almost was enough. The jeweller's shop smelled of metal polish, velvet, old wood, and rain carried in on customers' hems. Glass cases lined the walls. A clock ticked above a cabinet of mourning brooches. Behind the counter, Mr. Abel Pierce, the Bond Street jeweller, whose notice had first reached Staveley House, looked as though he had aged several years since sending it. He bowed low when Lydia entered, too low. Fear made courtesy clumsy. "Lady Lydia, Lady Marwen, I had not expected." "No," Lydia said, "that is why I came." His mouth closed. A younger man near the workroom door froze with a polishing cloth in one hand. He could not have been more than 17. Apprentice, Lydia thought, nervous, observant, perhaps honest if not frightened out of it. She set the velvet case on the counter but did not open it. "You recorded an alteration order in my name." Mr. Pierce swallowed. "The order was brought under your name, my lady." "That is not the same sentence." Lady Marwen's eyes gleamed. The apprentice looked down at his cloth. "No, my lady. Who brought it? A lady. That describes half of Bond Street on a dry afternoon." His face reddened. She was veiled, her voice low, refined. Her gloves. At that, the apprentice's head lifted before he could stop himself. Lydia turned toward him. Mr. Pierce stiffened. "Thomas, return to the workroom." "No," Lydia said. The word was not loud, but it made both men still. "Thomas will remain if he saw what you did not." The apprentice looked from Lydia to Lady Marwen, and then to the open shop door, where one of the North-wick footmen could be seen across the street, pretending great interest in a milliner's window. "I don't want trouble, my lady." "Neither do I, yet trouble appears to have been ordered in my name." His throat moved. She wore pale green gloves. The clock seemed suddenly louder. Lydia felt Lady Marwen's attention sharpen beside her. "Are you certain?" Lydia asked. "Yes, my lady." They were fine kid, very pale, almost silver in the light. One finger had a darker mark near the seam, as if ink or dye had touched it. Pale green gloves. Elspeth in the winter garden. Elspeth at the opera. Elspeth's hand at Lydia's bracelet. The shape of suspicion tightened into something with edges. Did she remove them? No, my lady. Thomas twisted the cloth, but she held the clasp she wanted copied. I remember because she said the old chain must be removed, not repaired. Mr. Pierce was with another customer, and I wrote the first note before he entered it properly. Mr. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. The order was ordinary in appearance. No, Lydia said. It was made to appear ordinary. She opened the velvet case and turned the bracelet toward the apprentice. Did she bring this bracelet? Thomas leaned forward, careful not to touch. Not the whole of it. She had a sketch and a small clasp fitting wrapped in tissue. She said the lady wanted the new hinge to match the old frame. But the chain gone. The lady, Lydia repeated. Meaning me? She gave your name. And you believed her? Shame moved across his young face. Ladies often send servants or companions. We don't always see the owner. I understand. She did, and that was the most galling part. The scheme had used custom, convenience, and feminine trust as its cover. Did she write anything, Mr.? Pierce reached beneath the counter and produced a small workroom slip. The original rough notation. I had not thought it useful beside the ledger. Lady Marwen made a sound of elegant disgust. Men rarely think the first version useful until the second version lies. Lydia bent over the slip. There was the false version of her name, copied more hurriedly than on the ledger, and beneath it a small smear of dark ink near the fold. Thomas pointed, emboldened now. That mark came from her glove, I think. She touched it before the ink dried. Lydia looked at the smear and imagined Elspeth's pale green finger pressing down the future ruin of a friendship. I will need this preserved. Of course, Mr. Pierce said quickly. Mr. Wexford may collect it with your statement. You will write what you have told me, Mr. Pierce. Thomas will write what he saw. The apprentice stared. Me, my lady, especially you. His eyes widened, not with fear now, but with the startled dignity of someone whose small truth had been deemed large enough to matter. Yes, my lady. From the jeweller's shop, Lydia and Lady Marwen went directly back to Staveley House. But Lydia did not go upstairs to rest. She asked for the household room, where the family register was kept when not displayed for ceremonies. It was a narrow chamber behind her father's library, with locked cabinets, dustless shelves, and a writing table where servants prepared household accounts. The replaced register page had been removed for examination, but the book itself had been returned under Lady Marwen's authority. Mrs. Keene, the housekeeper, stood pale with worry near the cabinet. I would never have let anyone tamper with it knowingly, my lady. I believe you, Lydia said. Tell me who asked to see it the night before the breakfast. Mrs. Keene twisted her keys. Miss Loxley came with a list from your father's secretary. Seating corrections, she said. She was always welcome in the house. We thought nothing of it. Was she alone? For a few minutes, I was called to the silver pantry because one of the breakfast urns had been miscounted. Called by whom? Mr. Mowbray's man brought the message. Lady Marwen's face hardened. Lydia placed one hand on the edge of the cabinet. The scheme had not been a single impulsive cruelty. It had moved through doors, errands, ledgers, gloves, servants, and pages. It had known exactly where women were trusted and where servants were too busy to question a familiar guest. "Did Miss Loxley wear gloves?" Lydia asked. Mrs. Keene frowned in memory. "Pale green, my lady. I remember because she tapped the register with one finger and left a thread caught near the binding. I meant to brush it away, but Mr. Wexford asked that nothing more be touched after the page was found wrong." Lydia closed her eyes for one breath. Not grief, relief. A terrible kind of relief, but relief all the same. Proof was no longer only pain arranged in memory. It had fibre, ink, witness, a young apprentice fear, a housekeeper's loyalty, a thread still caught because one careful man had stopped a room from tidying away the truth. When she returned to the drawing-room, a note waited from North-wick House. The sight of his seal tightened her chest before she could command it not to. Lady Marwen watched silently as Lydia opened it. The Duke's handwriting was precise, restrained, and stripped of defence. "Lady Lydia, I have received word that you went to Bond Street as you intended. I will not ask what you discovered before you choose to tell me. I write only to say this. I mistook silence for safety, and I wronged you. I thought I could spare you pain by narrowing the room in which truth must stand. In doing so, I placed my judgment where your voice belonged. I am sorry. I will not ask forgiveness by letter. I will ask only whether you will permit me to hear you in Lady Marwen's drawing-room at whatever hour you name. Gervase Fenton." Lydia read it twice. The apology did not restore the sapphire ring to her hand. It did not erase the note about private retraction, or the moment his instinct had frightened her. But it did not excuse itself. It did not dress control as devotion. It waited. That, too, was evidence. She folded the letter carefully. "Aunt," she said, "send to His Grace. Tomorrow afternoon. Here." Lady Marwen's mouth softened. "You are certain?" Lydia looked toward the closed velvet case, toward the room where the register had lied, toward the street where truth had begun to gather witnesses. "No," she said, "but I am willing to hear whether certainty can be earned." The next afternoon, rain threatened but did not fall, leaving London suspended beneath a grey sky that seemed unable to decide whether mercy or inconvenience would suit it better. Lady Marwen had chosen her own drawing-room for the meeting, not Staveley House and not North-wick House, because neutrality, she said, was sometimes the only chaperone men truly feared. Lydia arrived with the coral cameo in its velvet case, the jeweller's rough slip copied and sealed, and the knowledge of pale green gloves folded inside her like a blade. The sapphire courtship ring was still not on her hand. Lady Marwen had placed it in a small porcelain dish on the mantel, visible enough to be remembered, distant enough not to command. Lydia noticed it when she entered. She noticed it again when the Duke of North-wick was announced. Gervase Fenton crossed the threshold with none of the icy assurance society expected from him. He was composed, yes, but not untouched. Lydia saw it in the way his gaze found the ring and did not linger, in the way he bowed to Lady Marwen before he looked at Lydia, in the deliberate stillness of his hands. He had come prepared not to be forgiven. That mattered. It should not have mattered so much. Lady Marwen sat near the window with her embroidery, though Lydia knew very well she had not made a stitch all morning. "Your Grace," she said, "my niece has agreed to hear you. I have not agreed to leave the room." "I would not ask it," he said. Then he turned to Lydia. "Thank you for permitting me to come." Lydia stood beside the table where she had arranged the velvet case and the copied statements. "I permitted you to be heard. That is not the same as restoring what was lost. No, the word came without defense. It is not." The quiet steadiness of it made the room smaller. Lydia had expected perhaps explanation first, then regret, then a careful argument that his motive had been noble. She had prepared answers to all three. He gave her none of them. He stood before her and said, "I was wrong." Lady Marwen's needle paused in the air. Lydia's fingers tightened against the table edge. "Specifically?" she asked. His eyes held hers. "Specifically, I allowed my fear of public cruelty to become distrust of your strength. I saw that the bracelet was being used to injure you. And instead of asking where you wished the truth to stand, I tried to choose a smaller room for it. I thought suppression would protect your mother's memory. In truth, it would have left her name and yours dependent upon my private management." Lydia felt the words move through her, each one, finding the place where anger had been guarding hurt. "Yes, I also mistook influence for care. Yes, and I made you feel that the evidence you had fought to preserve might vanish if I decided silence was kinder." Her breath caught. That was the deepest cut, named so plainly that it could no longer hide beneath indignation. "Yes," she said, and this time the word was softer. He lowered his head once, not quite a bow, not quite surrender. "I'm sorry, Lydia. Her name, spoken without title, should have been too familiar. It was, perhaps, yet there was no possession in it, only remorse." Lady Marwen did not correct him. Lydia looked away first, because she could not bear to have him see how close his apology had come to the place where forgiveness waited, but had not yet been earned. "Why?" she asked. "Why was silence the first answer your mind trusted?" For the first time, the Duke's composure faltered in a way no stranger in a ballroom would have detected. Lydia detected it. She had learned his stillness well enough by now to see when it cost him more. He glanced toward the rain-dark window. "My mother was accused once," he said. "Not of theft, not of anything that could be proved in a ledger. A letter was produced, supposedly in her hand, suggesting an attachment before her marriage. It was false. My father knew it was false. Several people knew. But the family decided that quiet protection would spare her. The letter was bought, hidden, denied only in private. No public correction was made. Lydia forgot the ring. She forgot even the bracelet for a moment. What happened to her? She lived respectably. The answer was colder than grief, which is not the same as being believed wherever she went. The old doubt walked behind her. Those who knew the truth congratulated themselves on discretion. Those who did not know it supplied their own version. By the time I was old enough to understand, there was nothing left to refute. Only a silence everyone called mercy. Lady Marwen's embroidery lowered into her lap. Lydia saw, suddenly and painfully, the shape beneath his mistake. He had not tried to bury her truth because he thought it unimportant. He had tried because some frightened part of him still believed speed might save what silence had once destroyed. But explanation was not absolution. He had said so himself. "Then you know," Lydia said. "Better than most, what private protection costs." "Yes," his voice roughened, "and still I reached for it. That is the part for which I have no excuse." The honesty entered the room like light without warmth, necessary and difficult. Lydia moved to the table and opened the velvet case. The cameo's carved profile looked upward, patient and worn. At the jeweller's shop, the apprentice remembered pale green gloves, a dark mark near one seam. He also remembered that the lady brought a clasp fitting and a sketch, not the bracelet itself. In our household room, Mrs. Keene remembered Elspeth asking to correct seating names beside the register. She wore pale green gloves there too. A thread caught in the binding remains untouched. The Duke listened without interrupting. No command entered his face. No strategy crossed before her words were complete. Only when she stopped did he say, "Then the evidence chain is stronger than I knew. It is not complete." "No, but it is no longer fragile. Neither am I." His eyes returned to hers. "No," he said, "you are not." There was admiration there again, but now it was humbled by what he had nearly lost. Lydia turned the bracelet slightly in its case. Goldsmiths' Hall has agreed to hear the matter. A charity patronage audit can be called the day after tomorrow. Mr. Wexford has secured the jeweller, the apprentice, Mrs. Keene's statement, and the copied register comparison. If you consent, the matter will be examined before witnesses who cannot be dismissed as your friends or mine. I will speak first. Yes, you will not interrupt if they wound me politely. His jaw tightened. I will not interrupt unless you ask me to, or unless someone crosses from insult into actionable slander. Despite herself, Lydia almost smiled. You have made even restraint sound legal. It is safer for me when disciplined by terminology. The faint humor did not erase the pain. It made room beside it. Lydia looked toward the porcelain dish on the mantel. The sapphire ring caught the grey light. I am not ready to wear that again. I did not expect you to be, but I am willing for Lady Marwen to keep it here. Something in his expression changed, not relief exactly, because he did not claim enough to be relieved, but the careful easing of a man who had been allowed to remain at the threshold. Thank you. The words were too quiet for grandeur. Lydia drew a breath. She had not intended to move, yet standing apart suddenly felt like continuing a punishment after the lesson had been learned. Not forgotten. Learned. She stepped around the table. The Duke went still. She stopped before him, close enough to see a small line of fatigue near his mouth. I am still angry. You should be. I am still hurt, I know, and I do not yet trust you as I did in the carriage. His eyes darkened. I know that too. She looked at his hands, held carefully at his sides, disciplined even now. But I believe you are trying to become worthy of being trusted again. His breath changed. That was all. A small surrender. I am afraid, he said. I have come to want your trust more than my own peace. The words struck deeper than any polished declaration could have done. They were not love. Not yet. But they were the first honest shape of need. Lydia felt her anger shift, not vanish, but make space for something tender and frightening. She stepped closer. He did not move toward her. May I hold you? He asked, so softly that only she and Lady Marwen could hear. Lydia closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them. Yes. His arms came around her with restrained care, giving her every chance to step away. She did not. She rested her forehead for one brief moment against his coat, and felt him go utterly still, as if her trust, partial and wounded though it was, had become something sacred. Then his hold steadied, warm and careful, neither claiming nor concealing her. Lydia let herself be held for the length of 3 heartbeats. Then she stepped back first, and he released her at once. Lady Marwen looked very intently at the embroidery she had not touched. Lydia's cheeks warmed, but she did not regret it. At Goldsmiths' Hall, she said, voice steadier than before, I shall not be hidden behind you. The Duke bowed his head. No, you shall stand where truth can hear you. Lydia turned toward the cameo case and closed it gently. Outside, the rain finally began, tapping against the windows like 1,000 small witnesses arriving on time. By the time Lydia entered Lady Marwen's drawing room, 2 days later, the room had already learned how to lie politely. Every chair had been placed as though the gathering were an ordinary consultation before the Goldsmiths' Hall audit. Yet no one mistook the arrangement for peace. Rupert Mowbray stood near the mantel with the restless impatience of a man who had begun to suspect that charm could not settle accounts. Miss Elspeth Loxley sat beside Mrs. Mowbray in pale muslin, her face composed in a fragile sorrow that made every accusation against her look, at first glance, like cruelty. Lord Staveley hovered near the window, wretched and indignant in alternating turns. Mr. Wexford had placed a narrow portfolio on the central table. Lady Marwen sat beside it like a guard posted before a treasury. The Duke of North-wick stood behind no one. That was the first thing Lydia noticed. He had taken a place at the side of the table, near enough to support, far enough not to command. When she entered, his gaze met hers only briefly, but the steadiness of it moved through her like a remembered hand at her back. Yesterday, he had held her after asking permission. Today, he did not reach for anything. He simply waited for her to decide where she would stand. Lydia chose the place opposite Elspeth. Her mother's coral cameo bracelet lay in its velvet case on the table, still altered, still incomplete, no longer merely beloved. The broken safety chain remained sealed under Lady Marwen's red wax, the jeweller's rough slip, the copied ledger, and Thomas, the apprentice's statement, waited in Mr. Wexford's portfolio. The replaced register page had been removed from Staveley House for examination and placed beneath a sheet of protective paper. The pale green thread remained caught in the binding, untouched. Every object had its place. Every lie had begun to lose one. "This meeting is unnecessary," Rupert said before anyone sat. His voice carried the brittle authority of a gentleman frightened by servants' memories. "Tomorrow's audit will only deepen the scandal. Surely Lady Lydia has suffered enough." Lydia removed her gloves slowly, finger by finger, and placed them beside her reticule. "How considerate of you to discover concern after arranging the injury." Elspeth flinched. "Lydia, don't, please. You speak as if Rupert wished you harm. He has been foolish, perhaps, but not cruel. Then he has been remarkably talented by accident." Lady Marwen's fan gave a small, approving snap. Mrs. Mowbray stiffened. "I must protest this tone. My nephew has been placed in an impossible position." "No," the Duke said quietly. "An impossible position is one chosen for you by others. Mr. Mowbray has been uncomfortable, which is a lesser condition and more deserved." Rupert's face reddened, but before he could answer, Lydia lifted one hand. The Duke stopped at once, so did the room. That obedience, immediate and visible, changed the air more than any declaration could have done. Lydia did not look at him, though she felt the choice like warmth. She faced Rupert. "You wished to say, I was desperate after your changed affections. Say it plainly." Rupert's mouth worked once. Elspeth leaned forward, eyes shining. "No one wants to call you desperate. Then, no one should have created so many occasions to imply it." Elspeth pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "I only told Mrs. Mowbray that you were unlike yourself after the breakfast. Anyone would be. When I saw you clinging to that bracelet and then heard there had been an alteration order, I feared confusion. I feared you might have done something rash and then forgotten it in distress." Lydia looked at the handkerchief. Fine linen, tiny embroidered violets. Elspeth had always understood the usefulness of details. "You feared I altered my mother's bracelet, forgot it," pursued a duke, "and then falsely accused others because my fiancé preferred you." Silence sharpened the room. Elspeth's tears paused, as if even they required instruction. "I never said it so harshly. No, you have always preferred others to do the harshness after you supply the lace." Rupert stepped in quickly. "Enough. If there was any irregularity at the jeweller's, It may have been a servant. Ladies send servants on errands every day. A maid could have misunderstood or taken advantage or wished to profit from returning an altered clasp. "Which maid?" Lydia asked. "How should I know? You raised her." "I raised a possibility." Possibilities are cheap when they require someone poorer to carry them. The words struck harder than Lydia expected, because the housekeeper's pale face rose in her mind, and Thomas the apprentice clutching his polishing cloth. So many schemes survived because the powerless were convenient. Mr. Wexford opened his portfolio. "Since Mr. Mowbray has introduced the idea of servant blame, perhaps we should begin with the register." He placed the Staveley family register on the table. The room leaned toward it despite itself. Lydia did not. She waited until Mr. Wexford turned to the final page. "Lady Lydia," he said, "will you examine the page as you requested?" She stepped forward. The paper lay smooth, clean, and nearly convincing. Nearly. The first time she had seen the register, she had been too humiliated to notice anything but the empty place where her future was meant to be written. Now she saw the page as an object, not a fate. She placed one fingertip near the edge without touching the ink. "It is narrower," she said. Lord Staveley blinked. "What? The page. It is cut narrower than the others by perhaps half an inch." Mr. Wexford nodded. "Confirmed." Lydia looked at Mrs. Keene's signed statement. The household room was left unattended after a message came from Mr. Mowbray's man about the silver urns. During those minutes, Miss Loxley remained with the register, claiming she wished to correct seating names. Elspeth rose halfway. "That is monstrous. I was helping your household. You were always very good at helping yourself through doors. Lydia, I don't know how grief has made you so unkind. Grief did not make me observant. You did." The Duke moved then, not forward, but to the side of the table. He waited until Lydia's eyes touched his. Permission, not rescue. She gave the smallest nod. Only then did he speak. "Mr. Wexford." The solicitor lifted a small glassine packet. Inside lay a single pale green thread, so slight that several witnesses narrowed their eyes to see it. "This thread," Mr. Wexford said, "was found caught in the register binding after the replaced page was discovered. Mrs. Keene states that Miss Loxley wore pale green gloves while alone with the book." Elspeth went very still. Not pale, still. Lydia knew the difference now. Paleness could be performed. Stillness was fear before it found costume. Mrs. Mowbray gave a sharp breath. Rupert looked at Elspeth too quickly. There it was. The first crack not in her story, but in his trust of it. "Many ladies own pale green gloves," Elspeth said. "Indeed," Lydia replied. "But not all of them wore them while adjusting my bracelet, visiting the register, and sending a veiled woman's order through a jeweller's apprentice who remembered a dark mark near one seam." Elspeth's eyes flashed. "You cannot prove that was me." "Not yet," Lydia said. "Tomorrow will be more thorough." Rupert stepped away from the mantel. "Elspeth, what is this?" She turned on him with a whisper sharp enough to cut through the room. "Don't be stupid." The words fell before she could soften them. Their ugliness was small, but utterly real. Rupert recoiled, as if he had glimpsed the machinery behind the veil. A footman appeared at the door after a discreet knock and crossed to Lady Marwen. She listened, then looked at the Duke. "A maid from Miss Loxley's household has been stopped at the side entrance. She was carrying a wrapped parcel and claimed it was lace for repair." Elspeth stood fully now. "You had no right to stop my maid." "My side entrance," Lady Marwen said. "My right." The Duke did not move toward Elspeth. He looked at Lydia. The room seemed to wait with him. Lydia understood then that this was the moment when an older version of herself would have stepped aside for a man of rank to finish the matter. She would have allowed his title to strike the blow and then wondered why victory felt borrowed. Not now. She turned to Lady Marwen. "Have the parcel brought here, please." The maid entered trembling, followed by a servant carrying a folded square of brown paper tied with thread. Lydia felt pity for the girl before suspicion. "No one here will punish you for telling the truth," she said. "But lies told for gentlefolk have a way of becoming servants' crimes." The maid burst into tears. "Miss Loxley told me only to carry it out, my lady." "I didn't know what it was. She said it was old trimming." The parcel was opened. Inside lay a small gold clasp fitting wrapped in tissue, new enough to shine, marked at the underside with the faint scratch Thomas the apprentice had described. The room did not gasp. It inhaled and forgot to release. Elspeth's face emptied of colour at last. Lydia looked at the clasp, then at the cameo bracelet in its velvet case, then at the Duke. He stood exactly where he had promised to stand, beside the truth, not before it. Lydia's hand, moving before pride could stop it, touched his sleeve lightly, just once. A private signal. "I am ready." His eyes lowered to the touch, then returned to her face, with something fierce and quiet held behind them. He did not cover her hand. He did not make the moment public property. Lydia withdrew and faced the room. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will take every piece to Goldsmith's Hall. The bracelet, the chain, the clasp, the ledger, the thread, the register page, and every statement. No more hints. No more pity, no more servants blamed for the sins of their betters." Rupert sat down heavily. Mrs. Mowbray said nothing. Elspeth stared at the opened parcel as though it had betrayed her. Lydia understood the feeling. Objects had been doing that all week. But this one, at last, had betrayed the right person. Goldsmith's Hall had never looked less like a place for mercy. Its stone dignity rose from the city streets with the severe confidence of institutions that had witnessed generations of English families bargain, prosper, fail, and pretend that reputation was a form of virtue. Lydia stepped from Lady Marwen's carriage with the coral cameo bracelet secured in its velvet case, not on her wrist. The morning was clear, too clear for hiding. Behind her came Lady Marwen, carrying the sealed envelope that held the broken gold safety chain. Mr. Wexford arrived from the opposite direction with his portfolio, the copied jeweller's ledger, the rough workroom slip, Thomas, the apprentice's written statement, the preserved pale green thread, and the narrowed register page. The intercepted clasp fitting had been wrapped separately and marked. Everything had been witnessed, sealed, and carried by the proper person. Nothing existed in two places. Nothing had been allowed to vanish. At the entrance, Gervase Fenton, Duke of North-wick, waited beside the carved doorway, dark-coated and still, his face composed for society and his eyes reserved for her. He bowed to Lady Marwen first, then to Lydia. He did not offer his arm. Not yet, not before the room had seen her enter by her own strength. "Lady Lydia," he said quietly, "all witnesses are assembled. And you remember, you speak first." That was enough. Inside, the audit chamber had been arranged with restrained cruelty by people who believed arrangement could civilize scandal. At the long table sat two patronesses of the charity, the jeweller Mr. Pierce, Mr. Vale from the inspection, Thomas the apprentice with hands clenched beneath the table, Mrs. Keene pale but upright, Lord Staveley, Mrs. Mowbray, Rupert and Elspeth. Elspeth wore grey today as if innocence had put on mourning. Rupert looked sleepless. Lydia felt no triumph at that. Cowardice without sleep was still cowardice. A clerk announced the matter. as a question concerning the provenance and alteration of a coral cameo bracelet presented at a charitable inspection. The phrase was tidy enough to make Lydia want to break it open. She stepped forward before anyone could soften the wound into procedure. "My mother's bracelet was not bait for a duke," she said. The chamber stilled. It was the last kindness she fastened around my wrist. No one breathed loudly now. Lydia opened the velvet case and placed the bracelet on the table. The old coral profile faced upward, patient after weeks of being misnamed. This bracelet belonged to Lady Staveley. Its original safety chain was added years ago after the clasp once failed. That chain did not disappear by my order. It broke and fell at my betrothal breakfast after Miss Elspeth Loxley adjusted the clasp and before Mr. Rupert Mowbray publicly abandoned me. Mrs. Mowbray made a faint protest, but Lady Marwen laid the sealed envelope beside the case and the protest died. "This is the chain," Lydia continued, "found by His Grace beneath the breakfast table and sealed that day under my aunt's wax." Mr. Wexford opened the envelope before the witnesses and set out the delicate gold curve. Then came the ledger entry from Bond Street, naming Lydia for an alteration she had not requested. Then the duplicate alteration order, the rough slip with its dark smear, and the apprentice's testimony that the veiled lady wore pale green gloves and brought a clasp fitting and sketch, not the whole bracelet. Thomas's voice shook when called upon, but he did not retreat. "She said the chain must be removed, my lady." "Not repaired, removed." Lydia turned to Elspeth. "You wore pale green gloves at the breakfast, at the register room, and at the opera." Elspeth's chin lifted. "Many ladies own pale gloves. Not all leave thread behind, Mr." Wexford placed the register page before the witnesses. The difference in width was visible once pointed out, 1/2 an inch. Such a small theft of paper, such a large theft of truth. He then presented the pale green thread caught in the binding, and Mrs. Keene's statement that Elspeth had asked to correct seating names while alone with the register after a message from Mr. Mowbray's man had drawn the housekeeper away. Last came the intercepted parcel. The clasp fitting gleamed on its tissue with Thomas's maker's scratch faint beneath the gold. Mr. Pierce bent close and confirmed it. Vale, red with humiliation, admitted that his hesitation at the charity inspection had been based on a copied ledger and gossip conveyed before the event, not upon knowledge of the Staveley heirloom. Lydia let each admission settle. She did not rush. Truth, once forced to stand in public, deserved time to be recognized. Rupert broke first. "I never meant for the bracelet matter to go so far." Elspeth turned on him. "Rupert, no." His voice cracked, but self-preservation gave it volume. "You said she would accept quiet disgrace once His Grace offered for her. You said she would not risk her mother's name. I only needed the engagement ended before my creditors pressed my uncle. You said your godmother's money would settle everything after we married." Mrs. Mowbray closed her eyes. Elspeth rose, colour burning through her fragile greyness. "You contemptible fool." The words finished what evidence had begun. The performance was gone. In its place stood envy, sharp and human and ugly. She had everything, Elspeth said, and now she looked at Lydia as if the room had vanished. A father who would still fight for her even when he was useless at it. A dead mother everyone turned into a saint. Even Rupert chose her first because she looked so dignified in corners. I wanted to be chosen while she watched, just once. Lydia felt the confession enter her without surprise. It did not heal the wound. It merely explained the hand that had made it. "You were chosen as my friend," Lydia said. You decided that was beneath you. Elspeth's mouth trembled, but no tears came. The senior patroness removed her name from the charity committee at once and stated that Miss Loxley would no longer be received under her protection. Mrs. Mowbray declared Rupert's conduct indefensible with the haste of a woman saving what remained of her family. Mr. Wexford, calm as a clock, informed Rupert that his creditors would receive notice of his admitted motive, and any engagement prospects built on concealment would be treated accordingly. These were not prison chains or theatrical ruin. They were worse for people who had lived by appearances. Doors closing, credit narrowing, invitations ending, names repeated accurately. Only after Lydia had spoken, only after the evidence had stood, did the Duke step forward. Lady Lydia's honour did not come from my offer, he said. It was never mine to lend. My offer in that winter garden refused only to let dishonour speak alone. Lydia looked at him then, and the ache inside her changed shape. Not gratitude, recognition. After the chamber emptied and witnesses withdrew to carry the correct version of the story into London, Lydia found herself in a small, retiring room near the hall, with Lady Marwen tactfully stationed by the open door. The city sounded distant beyond the windows. Gervase stood before her, no longer a duke before witnesses, but a man who had learned where not to stand. "May I kiss you, Lydia?" he asked. No title, no command, no assumption. Lydia stepped closer and placed her hand on his sleeve, the same private signal she had given before battle, only softer now. Yes. His hand rose to her cheek with reverent care, giving her every moment to turn away. She did not. The kiss was restrained, warm, and full of all the words they had refused to spend before truth had earned them. When he drew back, his forehead nearly touched hers, but he waited. "I love you, Lydia," he said. His voice was low, unsteady in a way society would never hear. "Not because you needed saving, but because you stood when they expected you to disappear." Her heart opened painfully, freely. "And I love you, Gervase. I choose you freely." His eyes closed for one breath, as if the words had humbled him. Lydia looked toward the velvet case on the side table, where her mother's bracelet rested beside the recovered chain and clasp. "Then let no one say I was carried from one register to another," she said. "Court me properly." When he smiled at last, it was not victory, it was promise, with all the patience truth requires. 2 months after Goldsmiths' Hall taught London the difference between rumour and proof, Lydia stood in the morning room of North-wick House and watched sunlight find the restored coral cameo bracelet before it found her hand. The room was not arranged for spectacle. That was its mercy. No glass roof waited overhead. No register lay open like a trap. No row of witnesses leaned forward to decide what a woman's silence might mean. There were only pale walls, a quiet fire despite the mild morning, a bowl of early July roses on the table, and Lady Marwen seated near the window with the self-satisfied calm of an aunt who had spent 8 weeks ensuring propriety remained both visible and inconvenient. The bracelet rested in its velvet case on a square of white silk. Its old coral profile had been cleaned, but not polished into falseness. The repaired clasp bore a new hinge that did not pretend to be antique. The safety chain had been restored with the original gold, strengthened by an added link so fine that only Lydia would know where breakage had become survival. She liked that. She had not wanted the wound erased from the object. She had wanted it made honest. Gervase stood on the other side of the table, not touching the case, not reaching for the bracelet, not allowing even love to hurry what belonged first to memory. He had learned patience with a discipline that sometimes made Lydia ache. During the weeks after the audit, he had courted her as if the whole of England were listening for misconduct, and as if Lydia herself were the only audience whose judgment mattered. He had called at proper hours. He had walked beside her in Hyde Park, with Lady Marwen positioned close enough to hear and far enough to pretend she did not. He had sent books without inscriptions too intimate for servants' eyes, flowers without mournful meanings, and one note that said only, "I will never again mistake quiet for peace." Lydia had kept that note in the drawer where the sapphire courtship ring had lain until she chose, 3 weeks after Goldsmiths' Hall, to put it on again. Rupert Mowbray had departed London after creditors, relations, and common sense all reached him at once. His name still appeared in conversation, but no longer with pity. Mrs. Mowbray had become remarkably fond of the word unfortunate. Elspeth Loxley had been sent to a widowed cousin in Bath after every patroness worth impressing discovered pressing engagements elsewhere whenever her name was mentioned. Lydia had not asked after her again. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was freedom from carrying the blade after the wound had closed. The charity committee had corrected its record. Mr. Vale had written a formal apology. Mr. Pierce had preserved the original shop slip. Thomas the apprentice had been recommended by the Duke to a better position, not as a bribe for honesty, but as payment society too rarely made to the lower person who dared tell the truth. And Lady Staveley's old account book, produced by Lady Marwen with great triumph and very little humility, had confirmed the original safety chain in a hand no one could dispute. Truth had not healed everything in a day. It had done something better. It had stayed. "You may take it up," Lady Marwen said now, though her voice was softer than usual. "It is yours." "It was always mine." "Yes," her aunt replied, "but sometimes a woman must reclaim what she never surrendered." Gervase's eyes lifted at that, and Lydia felt the quiet movement of his attention like warmth. She picked up the bracelet. The gold was cool at first, then changed with her touch. For years, her mother's cameo had been courage borrowed from the dead. At the betrothal breakfast, it had become evidence. At the inspection, an accusation. At Goldsmiths' Hall, a witness. Today, at last, it could be a bracelet again, though not only that. Lydia slid it around her own wrist. No one fastened it for her. The clasp resisted slightly, unfamiliar in its repaired strength. She breathed once, steadied her fingers, and closed it. The safety chain followed. It lay against her skin with a lightness that almost hurt. She had expected triumph. What came instead was tenderness. "There," Lady Marwen said, and for once did not cover her emotion with sharpness. "Your mother would approve the workmanship, if not the fuss required to obtain it." Lydia smiled through the pressure in her throat. She always did dislike waste. Then she would be pleased that scandal has been converted into a marriage settlement. Gervase glanced toward the papers on the side table. They had been signed that morning after weeks of careful negotiation. Lydia's personal property was named clearly, including the cameo bracelet, her mother's letters, her pin money, and the small inheritance her father had nearly forgotten belonged to her. More than that, a modest fund had been established under Lady Marwen's supervision for women whose reputations had been damaged by false claims. They lacked the power to answer. Gervase had suggested it. Lydia had altered the terms until the fund carried her mother's name and required no woman to beg publicly before receiving assistance. "Not converted," Lydia said, answered. "Better," Gervase said. Lady Marwen rose with a rustle of silk. "I shall examine the garden from the window in the next room. If either of you forgets that doors remain open in respectable houses, I shall remember loudly." Lydia laughed then, fully and without surprise. Lady Marwen left the door wide enough for propriety and narrow enough for kindness. When she was gone, the room did not become improper. It became honest. Gervase remained where he was until Lydia looked at him. "May I come nearer?" he asked. The question still moved her. Not because she feared him, because he had never stopped honoring the answer. Yes. He came around the table and stopped before her. His gaze moved to the bracelet, then to her face. "I have asked you once before in public, before witnesses who did not understand you. I have asked you in forms since then, through calls, settlements, and patience. Today I ask with no scandal requiring haste and no room demanding performance." His voice deepened, not with command, but with feeling carefully held. "Lydia, will you marry me because you love me, and because you believe I will spend my life honoring the truth you taught me to stand beside?" Her heart did not leap wildly. It opened with a steadier joy, the kind that could survive mornings, ledgers, silence, and age. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you because I love you, because you learned, because when you failed me, you did not ask me to pretend it had not happened, because you let me speak first and still wished to remain after hearing everything I was." His eyes grew bright in a way she had never seen before. "Everything you are is more than I deserved to find. Do not become too humble, Your Grace. It will alarm the servants." His laugh was quiet, surprised, and dear. Then he offered his hand, palm upward, as he had in the carriage after her public humiliation. This time, Lydia did not need a long breath before accepting. She placed her bracelet-wearing hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful, and remained there. Not a rescue, not a claim, a chosen joining. He lifted her hand only far enough to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then, after meeting her eyes, bent and touched his lips to her forehead. Lydia leaned into him willingly. The gesture held no audience and needed none. "I love you still," she whispered. "Then I shall spend my life answering that gift honestly," he said. Outside the open door, Lady Marwen made a suspiciously loud observation about the roses needing pruning. Lydia smiled against Gervase's coat and did not move away at once. When she finally stepped back, the coral cameo gleamed between their joined hands, fastened by her own fingers, guarded by its visible chain, and no longer waiting to prove anything to anyone. She had entered one room to be discarded, another to be questioned, another to speak her truth. Now she stood in a quiet morning room with her mother's memory secure, her name restored, and her hand freely placed in the Duke's.